Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar electric lullaby as I began my third week of graveyard shifts at the Meridian Distribution Center. 3 a.m. in New Jersey felt like the world's armpit, humid, forgotten, and perpetually reeking of diesel fumes from the loading docks. The massive warehouse stretched before me like a concrete cathedral, its aisles disappearing into shadows that the overhead lights couldn't quite penetrate. I'd taken this job after my last one went sideways. Night security at a place this size meant walking endless corridors, checking locks, and babysitting a dozen monitors that showed the same empty hallways hour after hour. The pay was decent, and more importantly, it kept me away from people during my waking hours. After what happened in Philadelphia, solitude felt like medicine. The security office occupied a corner of the building's second floor, its windows overlooking the main floor like a watchtower. 12 monitors formed a semicircle around my desk, each one cycling through different cameras positioned throughout the facility. Most of the time, they showed exactly what you'd expect: empty conveyor belts, silent loading bays, and corridors that hadn't seen human presence since the day shift clocked out. But Monitor 7 had been acting strange. At first, I'd chalked it up to a technical glitch. The image would flicker occasionally, showing brief static before returning to its assigned camera feed from Corridor D7, a narrow passageway that connected the eastern storage wing to the main floor. Nothing unusual about the corridor itself, just another sterile pathway lined with beige walls and marked with faded safety notices. The problem was the figure that kept appearing on the screen. It started Tuesday night around 4 in the morning. I was doing my rounds on the western side of the building when I glanced at the monitors before heading downstairs. Monitor 7 showed a man standing in Corridor D7, motionless, facing the camera. The figure was far enough away that details were unclear, but something about his posture struck me as familiar. I assumed it was someone from the cleaning crew working late, though I hadn't seen anyone else in the building. When I radioed the night supervisor, she confirmed that no cleaning staff was scheduled, and the building should have been empty except for me. By the time I'd made my way to Corridor D7, it was empty. The next night, the same thing happened. Same figure, same position, same motionless stance. This time I tried something different. I stayed in the office and watched the monitor while radioing down to the main floor. The figure remained on the screen even as I confirmed that Corridor D7 was physically empty. Equipment malfunction, I told myself. Old buildings, old cameras, old wiring. These things happened. Wednesday night, I brought my phone and took a picture of Monitor 7. The image showed Corridor D7 clearly, but the figure wasn't there. Just an empty hallway. Yet when I looked directly at the monitor, the man remained, standing in the exact same spot. That's when I started paying attention to details I'd been unconsciously avoiding. The figure wore dark clothing that looked remarkably similar to my own security uniform. His height and build matched mine with uncomfortable precision, and though his face remained indistinct due to the camera's distance and resolution, something in his stance, the way he held his shoulders, the slight forward lean, felt like looking in a mirror. Thursday night brought the first real jolt of fear. I was reviewing the recorded footage from previous nights, hoping to find some technical explanation for what I was seeing. The recorded files showed Corridor D7 exactly as it should be: empty, quiet, unremarkable. But when I switched back to the live feed, the figure appeared again. This time, he was closer. The man stood perhaps 20 feet from the camera now, near enough that I could make out more details. The uniform was definitely security gear: black pants, dark shirt with reflective stripes. The ID badge clipped to his chest caught the corridor's fluorescent light at an angle that obscured any readable details, but the setup was identical to mine. What made my hands start shaking was his posture. The figure stood with his left hand slightly raised, as if holding something small. I looked down at my own left hand and saw my radio, positioned exactly the same way. I spent the rest of that shift avoiding Monitor 7, but peripheral vision kept drawing my attention back to it. Each time I glanced over, The figure seemed incrementally closer to the camera. Friday night, I almost didn't come to work. But mortgage payments and dwindling savings accounts don't care about your psychological comfort level. I showed up, badge scanned, logged in, and tried to convince myself that 5 nights of disturbed sleep had simply made me more susceptible to seeing patterns where none existed. The figure was now close enough to the camera that I could see his face. My face. Not similar. Not reminiscent. It was me, standing in that corridor, staring directly into the camera with an expression I couldn't quite read. The image quality wasn't perfect, but the features were unmistakable. The scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the slightly crooked nose from a bar fight in college, the way my mouth naturally turned down at the corners. I was looking at myself on that monitor, even though I was sitting in the security office 50 yards away. The rational part of my mind cycled through explanations. Stress, sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide poisoning, some kind of neurological issue. But the figure on monitor 7 moved independently of my actions. When I raised my hand to rub my forehead, he remained motionless. When I stood up from my chair, he continued standing in that corridor. That's when I noticed something else. The corridor shown on monitor 7 wasn't quite right. Corridor D7, which I'd walked dozens of times, had a fire exit door about halfway down its length. But the corridor on the monitor showed unbroken walls on both sides. No door, no exit, just a narrow passageway that seemed to stretch into darkness beyond the camera's range. I pulled up the building's floor plans on my computer. Corridor D7 was clearly marked, with the fire exit door noted in its proper position. The architectural drawings matched my memory perfectly, but monitor 7 showed a corridor without exits. The figure, my doppelganger, began moving on Saturday night. Not walking exactly, more like shifting position every few minutes. First closer to the camera, then angled slightly to the left, then turned to face down the corridor as if looking for something. His movements were subtle, easy to miss unless you were specifically watching. I started taking notes, documenting each change in position, trying to detect a pattern. The figure seemed to be searching for something, though what that might be remained unclear. He would move to the left wall, appearing to examine it closely, then shift to the right wall, then back to center. What disturbed me most was his expression during these movements. When he faced the camera directly, his features, my features, showed a combination of confusion and growing panic that I recognized too well. It was the same expression I'd been wearing for the past week. Sunday night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find the corridor shown on monitor 7. The building's layout was more complex than the main floor suggested. Multiple levels, sub-basements, service corridors, and maintenance areas created a 3-dimensional maze that extended far beyond what any single person could memorize. Some sections were accessible only through locked doors marked with warnings about authorized personnel. Using my master keycard, I began a systematic exploration of areas I'd never visited. The deeper I went into the building's infrastructure, the more the architecture seemed to shift away from the clean, modern design of the main floors. Older sections featured different materials, different lighting, different proportions. In the sub-basement, I found corridors that weren't marked on any of the floor plans I'd seen. These passages were narrower than the standard hallways, with lower ceilings and older fluorescent fixtures that cast a slightly different quality of light. The walls were painted the same institutional beige, but the paint was older, more worn, with scuff marks and stains that spoke of decades of use. And some of these corridors had no exit doors. The first one I found matched the proportions of what I'd been seeing on monitor 7, but the camera position was wrong. The second was too short. The third curved in a way that didn't match the monitor's straight-line perspective. It was in the 4th sub-basement corridor that I found it. The space was exactly as shown on monitor 7, narrow, straight, with unbroken walls on both sides. The fluorescent lights overhead cast the same quality of illumination I'd been watching for a week. At the far end, the corridor disappeared into darkness that seemed somehow deeper than normal shadow. But there was no camera. I walked the length of the corridor twice, examining every inch of wall and ceiling. No camera housing, no mounting brackets, No cables or conduits that might indicate surveillance equipment. The space was completely unmonitored, at least by any visible technology. Yet somehow, Monitor 7 was showing this corridor in real time. I returned to the security office with my mind churning through possibilities that ranged from rational to impossible. Hidden cameras, remote recording equipment, some kind of delayed playback system. None of these explanations adequately addressed what I'd observed. The figure was waiting on Monitor 7 when I returned, but now he was facing away from the camera, looking down the corridor toward that dark end I'd just visited. His posture suggested intense focus, as if he was trying to see something in the shadows that remained hidden from the camera's perspective. I watched for 20 minutes before he moved again. This time, he began walking toward the dark end of the corridor. His pace was steady but cautious, the gait of someone navigating uncertain territory. As he moved away from the camera, his figure became smaller and less distinct, until he was just a dark shape against the beige walls. He stopped about 10 feet before the corridor's end, where the fluorescent light faded into darkness. For several minutes, he remained motionless, apparently studying something beyond the camera's range. Then he turned around and began walking back. As he approached the camera position, his features became clear again. My features. But now the expression on his face had changed from confusion to something approaching terror. He stopped directly in front of where the camera should be, close enough that his face filled most of the monitor screen. His mouth moved as if he was speaking, but the surveillance system had no audio capability. I tried to read his lips, but the words were unclear. What came through was urgency, desperation, and an unmistakable warning. He raised his hand and pointed directly at the camera, directly at me, and his mouth formed a single word that I could read clearly. Run. Monday night, I didn't go to work. I called in sick and spent the day researching the Meridian Distribution Center's history. What I found in old newspaper archives and building permit records made my situation feel significantly worse. The building had been constructed in phases over several decades. The original structure dated back to the 1960s, but multiple expansions and renovations had created a complex infrastructure that even the current building management didn't fully understand. There had been incidents. In 1987, a night security guard named Marcus Chen had disappeared during his shift. He was found 3 days later in a sub-basement corridor that had been sealed off after construction of the East Wing. Chen was dehydrated and disoriented, with no memory of how he'd gotten there or what had happened during the missing time. In 1993, maintenance worker Robert Hayes reported seeing impossible surveillance footage that showed him in areas of the building he'd never visited. Hayes quit 2 weeks later and refused to discuss the details with investigators. In 2001, security supervisor Angela Morrison filed a report about malfunctioning cameras that showed temporal displacement in their feeds. The report was buried in administrative files, and Morrison was transferred to day shift shortly afterward. The pattern was clear, and I was apparently the latest addition to it. Tuesday night, I returned to work with a plan. If the figure on Monitor 7 was trying to warn me about something, I needed to understand what that something was. If the corridor existed in the building's physical space, then whatever was at its dark end was real and potentially dangerous. But if the entire experience was some kind of psychological break, then the best thing I could do was face it directly and force my mind to confront whatever reality lay behind the hallucinations. Either way, avoidance wasn't going to solve anything. The figure was waiting on Monitor 7, closer to the camera than ever before. This close, I could see details that made the whole experience even more unsettling. His security uniform was identical to mine, down to the small coffee stain on the left chest pocket that I'd gotten that very morning. His hair was disheveled in exactly the same way mine was after 8 hours of walking through climate-controlled air. But his eyes held knowledge that I didn't have. Looking at his face was like looking into a mirror held by someone who knew secrets about your future that you weren't supposed to discover. The expression was mine, but it carried weight and understanding that felt foreign. He raised his hand again and pointed down the corridor, toward the dark end. Then he pointed back at the camera. The message was clear. He wanted me to come to that corridor. I left the security office and made my way back to the sub-basement. The corridor was exactly as I'd found it before. Narrow, straight, unmonitored. But now, walking its length felt different, Each step carried weight, as if I was moving toward something inevitable rather than simply investigating an anomaly. At the dark end, I stopped where I'd seen the figure stop on the monitor. The darkness wasn't complete. My eyes adjusted enough to see that the corridor continued beyond what the fluorescent lights illuminated. There was something there, just barely visible in the shadows. Another corridor branched off to the right. This passage was even narrower than the one I was standing in, and it curved in a way that made it impossible to see where it led. The walls were older here, made of different materials that felt rough under my fingers. I followed the curve. The passage opened into a small room that shouldn't have existed according to any floor plan I'd seen. The space was circular, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, with a single fluorescent light fixture hanging from the center of the ceiling. In the middle of the room sat a chair facing a small table. On the table was a monitor. The monitor showed the security office where I'd been sitting for the past week. The image was clear and in real time. I could see my empty chair, my coffee cup, the arrangement of papers exactly as I'd left them. But superimposed over this familiar scene was another image, fainter but still visible. A figure sitting in the chair. Me, sitting in the chair, but older, not dramatically aged, but weathered in a way that suggested months or years of stress. This version of myself was staring at something off-screen with an expression of resigned horror. I approached the monitor for a closer look, and the figure on the screen turned to face me directly. His mouth moved, forming words I could almost understand. The audio was faint, like listening to someone speak through water, but I caught fragments. Can't leave. Corridor loops back. Been trying to warn. The image flickered, and suddenly I was looking at the security office again, but from a different angle. This camera seemed to be positioned somewhere I'd never noticed, showing the bank of monitors from behind my usual chair. On monitor 7, I could see the figure in the corridor, but now there were 2 figures. One was the version of myself I'd been watching all week. The other was me, standing in this hidden room, looking at this monitor. The implications hit me like ice water. I was watching myself watch myself, and the figure in the corridor had been trying to warn me about this moment, about this room, about this monitor that somehow connected all the disparate pieces of my experience into a loop that had no clear beginning or end. I turned to leave the room, but the curved passage I'd followed to get here was gone. The circular room now had 4 exits, each leading to an identical corridor that stretched into darkness. I checked each one, but they all looked the same. Narrow, beige-walled, fluorescent-lit passages that could have been the same corridor viewed from different angles. I chose the passage that felt most familiar and began walking. After what seemed like 20 minutes, I emerged into the circular room again. I tried a different exit. Same result. The third exit led to a stairway that climbed upward for several floors before opening into a corridor that looked identical to the ones below. Following this corridor eventually led me back to the circular room. The 4th exit simply curved back on itself, forming a perfect circle that brought me to where I'd started. I was trapped in a loop of corridors that existed somewhere within the building's infrastructure, but followed spatial rules that didn't match the physical world I understood. The monitor in the room continued showing the security office, but now the image included multiple versions of myself at different time periods. Some sat at the desk looking confused. Others paced the room frantically. One version was curled up in the corner, apparently having given up entirely. But all of them were watching Monitor 7, and on Monitor 7, all of them could see a figure trapped in a corridor without exits. I don't know how long I've been here. The fluorescent lights don't dim or brighten to indicate the passage of time. My watch stopped working shortly after I found this room, its hands frozen at 3:17. My phone has no signal, and its battery seems to drain and recharge randomly. Sometimes I see other figures in the corridors when I attempt to leave the room. Security guards wearing uniforms from different eras, maintenance workers carrying tools I don't recognize, people in business suits who might be management from decades past. They all have the same expression, the look of someone who followed a camera's view into a place that exists between the building's official layout and its physical reality. I've tried writing messages on the monitor's screen, hoping to warn the version of myself sitting in the security office. but my finger passes through the glass as if it's not quite solid. The only thing I can do is stand in the corridor and try to communicate the warning that I now understand the previous figure was trying to give me. The building's surveillance system doesn't just record what happens. It records what will happen. And once you've seen yourself in that future, the loop begins. I can see new figures appearing on the monitor now. Future security guards who will take this job, who will notice the strange behavior of Monitor 7, who will investigate and follow the same path I did. They're all walking toward the same circular room where I'm writing this. And I'm standing in the corridor, motionless, facing a camera that doesn't exist, trying to warn them not to come. But they can't hear me, and I know they won't listen. The corridor has no exits, but it always finds new people to fill it. I'm still here, somewhere between the building's floors and its surveillance system's predictions, watching myself watch myself in an endless loop of warnings that arrive too late. The only thing I know for certain is that I'm not alone, and neither are you, if you're reading this. Story 2. The first time I heard the footsteps, I assumed they belonged to another tenant. 3 measured steps echoing from the hallway outside my door, followed by what sounded like knuckles brushing against wood, so soft I might have imagined it. But the Brennan building had been converted to lofts specifically because most of the upper floors stood empty, and I'd chosen Unit 4B precisely for its isolation. I'd moved to Milwaukee 6 weeks ago, drawn by the promise of affordable workspace and the character that only century-old buildings could provide. The Brennan had both in abundance: exposed brick walls, original hardwood floors worn smooth by decades of footfall, and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the city's modest skyline, perfect for a freelance designer seeking inspiration and lower overhead costs. The footsteps always came at 3:17 a.m. I know because after the third night, I started checking my phone whenever that peculiar sequence woke me. 3 deliberate steps, each one landing with the weight of someone walking slowly, thoughtfully. Then the gentle knock, if it could even be called that. More like fingertips testing the surface of the door, feeling for something I couldn't identify. On the 4th night, I crept to the peephole. The hallway beyond shouldn't have extended more than 30 feet in either direction before meeting the stairwell and the emergency exit. I'd walked it dozens of times, had memorized every scuff mark on the industrial carpeting, every flicker in the overhead fluorescence. But through the convex lens of the peephole, the corridor stretched impossibly far, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow the light from the ceiling fixtures. The bulbs hung in perfect rows, just as they did during daylight hours, but now they pulsed with an erratic rhythm. One by one, starting from the far end of this extended hallway, they began to fail. Not burning out gradually, but exploding in tiny bursts of white sparks that fell like snow before vanishing into darkness. I pressed my eye harder against the peephole, certain my sleep-deprived mind was playing tricks. But the pattern continued. Pop, darkness, pop, darkness, each failed bulb bringing the wave of blackness closer to my door. When the destruction reached the light directly outside my threshold, I stumbled backward, heart hammering against my ribs. The next morning, I inspected the hallway. 30 feet of beige carpeting, 8 working fluorescent fixtures, and no evidence of any disturbance. The building superintendent, a gravelly-voiced man named Frank who'd worked there for 15 years, assured me that all the electrical systems had been updated within the past 5 years. No problems with the lights, he said, not meeting my eyes. Might want to check your sleep schedule, though. This place can play tricks on people who work too many late nights. But I hadn't been working late. I'd been maintaining a strict schedule. Work until 6 p.m., dinner, some reading, and in bed by 11. The footsteps had nothing to do with exhaustion. They had everything to do with the building itself. I began researching the Brennan's history, diving into city records and old newspaper archives. Built in 1892 as a garment factory, it had operated continuously until the 1970s, when manufacturing jobs fled the Midwest. For nearly 2 decades, it stood empty, accumulating dust and stories. The conversion to loft apartments had been completed only 3 years ago. though several units remained unoccupied. What I found in those records made my skin crawl. The factory had been designed with a peculiar feature, a service corridor that ran the length of each floor, allowing supervisors to monitor workers without being seen. These corridors had been sealed during the renovation, their entrances converted to storage closets or eliminated entirely, but architectural drawings showed they still existed, hidden within the walls like arteries in a body. The footsteps came again that night, right on schedule. This time, I was ready. I'd positioned myself near the door with my phone's camera app open, determined to document whatever I saw through the peephole. The 3 steps echoed clearly, leather soles on hard flooring, not the muffled tread of someone walking on carpet. When the soft knock came, I pressed my eye to the lens. The hallway had transformed again, but now I could see more details. The walls weren't painted drywall, but exposed brick, weathered and stained with age. Gas lamps flickered where fluorescent fixtures should have been, casting dancing shadows that made my stomach twist. And there, at the very edge of my vision, a figure in dark clothing walked slowly away from my door. The lights began failing again, starting from the far end. But this time I forced myself to watch the pattern. The explosions weren't random. They followed a specific sequence. 3 bulbs on the left side of the corridor, 1 on the right. 3 more on the left, skip 2, then 1 on the right. The pattern repeated until darkness consumed the hallway. I grabbed a notebook and sketched what I'd seen, marking each light's position and the order of their destruction. When I finished, I stared at the drawing for several minutes before the pattern became clear. It was Morse code. E, T, E, T, E. Come. My hands shook as I set the notebook aside. This couldn't be real. Sleep deprivation, stress from the move, the isolation of living alone in an unfamiliar city. Any combination of factors could explain what I was experiencing, but the message felt undeniably intentional, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me through the only medium available. The next day, I called in sick to my current project and spent hours researching the building's blueprints. The city planning office had digitized most historical documents, and I pored over floor plans, electrical schematics, and renovation notes. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. My unit, 4B, sat directly adjacent to one of the original service corridors. According to the 1892 architectural drawings, that corridor had connected to a network of similar passages that ran throughout the building. Workers used them to move between floors without disrupting production, and supervisors used them for surveillance. But the renovation plans showed something different. While most corridors had been properly sealed, the one beside my loft had simply been walled over at both ends, leaving the space intact. I was living next to a perfectly preserved piece of the building's past. That night, I didn't wait for the footsteps. At 3:15 a.m., I positioned myself at the door with tools I'd borrowed from Frank's maintenance closet. When the 3 steps echoed and the gentle knock came, I looked through the peephole to confirm the transformation had occurred. The impossible hallway stretched before me, gas lamps flickering ominously. Then I opened the door. The hallway on the other side bore no resemblance to the modern corridor I knew. Hardwood floors, darkened with age and moisture, stretched ahead of me. The air smelled of mildew and something else, a metallic tang that reminded me of old pennies. Water had collected in small puddles between the floorboards, as if rain had somehow found its way into this enclosed space. But there was no rain. There were no windows. And according to everything I knew about the building's layout, there should have been a wall 3 feet in front of me. I stepped into the hallway. My bare feet splashed into puddles that felt shockingly cold, and I realized the water wasn't collecting randomly. It flowed in thin streams along the floorboards, following channels worn into the wood by decades of use. The streams all moved in the same direction, toward the far end of the corridor where darkness waited. The gas lamps began failing as I watched, following the same pattern I'd observed through the peephole. E, T, E, T. But now I could hear the sequence too, a soft hissing as each flame died, leaving behind the acrid smell of burnt gas. Come. I followed the water. The corridor seemed to extend far beyond the building's actual dimensions. bending and turning in ways that defied the rectangular structure I'd memorized. Doors lined both walls, each one bearing a brass nameplate too tarnished to read. Behind some doors, I could hear the rhythmic clacking of machinery, as if the factory was still operational. Behind others, voices murmured in conversations I couldn't quite understand. The water streams converged at a junction where 3 corridors met. Here, the flow formed a small pool that reflected the dying gaslight like a dark mirror. I knelt beside it and saw my own face staring back. But the reflection seemed wrong somehow. My features appeared sharper, more angular, and my eyes held an expression of knowledge I didn't possess. The reflection's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I reached toward the water's surface, and my reflection reached back. Our fingertips touched the boundary between air and liquid, and suddenly I understood. The corridor wasn't trying to lead me somewhere. It was trying to show me something. The factory workers who had used these passages, the supervisors who had watched from hidden vantage points, the decades of lives that had played out within these walls, all of it had left an imprint, a recording that somehow became accessible when the conditions were right. When I pulled my hand back, the reflection smiled. I stood and turned to leave, but the corridor had changed again. The junction was gone, replaced by a single passage that stretched in both directions. The gas lamps had failed completely, leaving me in absolute darkness. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, but the device showed no signal, no time, no indication that the outside world continued to exist. Panic crept up my throat as I realized I might be lost in a space that existed only partially, trapped between the building's past and present. I chose a direction and began walking, trailing my fingers along the brick wall to maintain orientation. The water on the floor had deepened, now reaching my ankles, and I could feel things moving beneath the surface, not fish or insects, but something that brushed against my skin with deliberate intent. After what felt like hours, I saw light ahead. Not the warm glow of gas flames, but the harsh white of fluorescent bulbs. I hurried toward it, splashing through increasingly shallow water until I reached a familiar sight. The modern hallway outside my loft, complete with beige carpeting and institutional lighting. I stood there dripping, staring at my door with its brass number 4B gleaming under the overhead fixtures. When I looked back, the corridor extended its normal 30 feet to the stairwell. No brick walls, no gas lamps, no water, but my feet were still wet. I've been mapping the pattern for 2 weeks now. Every night at 3:17 the footsteps come, followed by the transformation. Each time I venture a little further into the corridor, documenting its layout and the messages spelled out by failing lights. The Morse code has grown more complex. Come deeper. Remember us. We are still here. I found rooms that exist only within the corridor, offices where spectral figures sit at antique desks, their fingers moving across ledgers that record no earthly transactions. I've discovered staircases that lead to floors the modern building doesn't possess. And always, there's the water, guiding me toward some destination I haven't yet reached. Frank, the superintendent, has started avoiding me. He claims I've been leaving my door open at night, creating drafts that disturb other tenants. But I know there are no other tenants on my floor. The building directory lists only my unit as occupied above the 3rd floor. Yesterday I found something that changed everything. In one of the hidden offices, I discovered a desk drawer filled with personnel files from the original factory. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but one caught my attention. James Brennan, listed as a supervisor from 1923 to 1954. According to his file, he'd been responsible for monitoring worker productivity through the service corridors, ensuring that production quotas were met and that no time was wasted. The photograph attached to his file showed a man with angular features and intense eyes that held an expression of knowledge that seemed unnaturally familiar. Tonight, I'll venture deeper into the corridor than ever before. The pattern of lights has been guiding me towards something specific, and I believe I'm close to finding it. The water flows strongest near what should be the center of the building, where architectural plans show no space should exist. I suspect I'll find James Brennan there, still walking his rounds, still supervising workers who punched out decades ago. And I suspect he's been waiting for someone to take over his duties. someone to ensure that the factory's work continues even in its absence. The transformation has already begun. When I look in mirrors now, my reflection wears the expression I first saw in the water. My features grow sharper each day, more suited to watching and waiting. The knowledge that doesn't belong to me fills my mind with shift schedules and production reports, with the names of workers who called in sick and the locations of machinery that no longer exists. I've started checking my phone at 3:17 a.m. without waiting for the footsteps. Soon, I won't need to wait at all. Soon, I'll be the one walking the corridor, maintaining the schedule, ensuring that someone remembers what was lost when the factory died. The lights are calling to me now, spelling out messages I understand perfectly. Your shift begins soon. I've been mapping the sequence of lights, but I realize now that they've been mapping me. Each night, each journey into the corridor, each moment spent learning its layout, all of it has been preparation for the moment when I stop being a visitor and become part of the building's permanent staff. The water on my feet never dries anymore. And sometimes, when I listen carefully in the small hours before dawn, I can hear new footsteps in the modern hallway outside my door. 3 measured steps, leather soles on carpet, followed by the soft sound of knuckles testing the surface of wood. Someone else has moved into the building. Someone else is about to discover what waits behind the peephole when the lights begin to fail. I should warn them, but supervisors have responsibilities. The work must continue, and new employees always need training. Soon, I'll be walking those rounds myself, ensuring that production never truly stops, even when the factory exists only in the spaces between what was and what is. The corridor is infinite after all. There's always room for one more. Story 3. The fog had been thick for 3 days when I first spotted her, a ghost ship materializing from the gray wall like something born from the mist itself. After 27 years fishing these waters off the Aleutian Islands, I'd seen my share of derelicts, but nothing quite like this sleek research vessel drifting silent and dark against the pewter sky. The Mary Catherine cut through the choppy swells toward the stranger, her diesel engine's steady rumble the only sound in the unnatural quiet that had settled over the sea. No gulls cried. No wind whistled through the rigging. Even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Through my binoculars, I could make out the vessel's name painted in faded blue letters across her stern. Kronos. A fitting name for a ship that looked like it had been lost to time itself. Her white hull showed patches of rust bleeding through like old wounds, and her superstructure rose in angular tiers that spoke of modern design now aged beyond recognition. What troubled me most was the absolute stillness of her. No lights flickered in the windows. No movement stirred on deck. She rode the swells with the passive surrender of something that had given up fighting the sea long ago. I'd radioed the Coast Guard 20 minutes earlier, reporting the derelict's position, but static had consumed their response. The radio crackled with interference that sounded almost like whispers, voices speaking in frequencies just beyond comprehension. I'd switched it off, telling myself it was just atmospheric disturbance from the persistent fog. As the Mary Catherine drew alongside the research vessel, I noticed the first peculiarity that would haunt me for hours to come. Hanging from hooks along the Kronos' port rail were dozens of wristwatches, men's watches, women's watches, digital and analog timepieces catching what little light filtered through the overcast sky. They swayed gently with the ship's motion, but something was wrong with their rhythm. The second hands moved in stuttering jerks, some spinning backward, others racing forward at impossible speeds. I cut the engine and let momentum carry us close enough to throw a line. The hull of the Kronos loomed above me, and I caught the scent that clung to her, not the familiar smell of rust and brine, but something antiseptic and strange, like ozone after lightning, or the metallic taste that fills your mouth before a seizure. My boots rang hollow on the research vessel's deck as I hauled myself over the rail. The watches seemed to sense my presence, their ticking growing louder, more urgent. Some displayed times that made no sense. 1347, 2583, impossible configurations of hours and minutes that my mind struggled to process. One digital watch near my elbow showed numbers scrolling backward so fast they blurred into a stream of red light. The deck itself felt wrong beneath my feet. The metal plates were warm despite the cold air, and they vibrated with a subsonic frequency that seemed to resonate in my bones. I found myself walking with careful, measured steps, as if the ship might notice sudden movements and react in ways I couldn't predict. The main laboratory doors stood open, revealing a corridor that stretched into darkness deeper than the fog outside. Emergency lighting cast red shadows that seemed to pulse like a slow heartbeat. I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space, but received no answer except the sound of my own words twisted by the ship's geometry into something I barely recognized. Each step forward felt like wading through thick air. The corridor walls were lined with instruments I couldn't identify, banks of monitors showing wave patterns and readouts in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Some displayed what appeared to be ocean charts, but the coastlines were wrong, showing archipelagos and continental shelves that belonged to no geography I knew. The smell grew stronger as I progressed deeper into the ship. Not quite chemical, not quite organic, something that reminded me of the moment between sleeping and waking, when dreams still cling to the edges of consciousness. My watch, I noticed, had stopped at 3:17, though I couldn't remember what time I'd boarded the Chronos. The main laboratory occupied the ship's central section, a vast space filled with equipment that hummed and whispered with its own life. Workstations lined the walls, their surfaces covered with notebooks filled with handwriting that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The writing was in English, but the words made no sense. Formulas that couldn't exist, observations of phenomena that defied physics. But it was the windows that made my skin crawl and my rational mind begin to fracture. 6 large portholes lined the laboratory's starboard wall, each offering a view of the ocean beyond. But no 2 windows showed the same sea. Through the first, I saw my familiar Alaskan waters under the gray sky I'd left behind. The second revealed tropical blue beneath blazing sunshine, waves that sparkled like scattered diamonds. The third showed a winter storm, mountainous waves crowned with foam, and lightning splitting a bruised sky. I moved from window to window, each view more impossible than the last. One showed a sea of glass under stars I didn't recognize. Another revealed waters so dark they seemed to absorb light, where shapes moved just beneath the surface. Massive forms that could have been whales or something far stranger. The final window showed an ocean frozen solid, its surface cracked like broken mirror reflecting an aurora that painted the ice in shifting colors. The worst part was the realization that came slowly, like cold water seeping through a hull breach. Each window showed the same ship, my Mary Catherine, floating in these impossible seas. In the tropical view, she rode bright swells under cloudless sky. In the storm, she fought mountainous waves with heroic persistence. In the starlit calm, she drifted like a toy boat on a cosmic pond. My legs gave out, and I found myself sitting heavily on a laboratory stool, staring at the windows while my mind tried to process what couldn't be real. The watches on deck ticked louder now, their sound penetrating the hull like a mechanical heartbeat that grew more irregular with each passing moment. I wanted to run, to return to my boat and motor away from this impossible vessel as fast as the Mary Catherine's engine could carry me. But when I looked toward the laboratory's exit, the corridor seemed longer than before, stretching away into a darkness that had grown deeper and more complete. A notebook lay open on the workstation beside me, its pages filled with the same shifting handwriting I'd seen throughout the ship. But as I stared at it, the words began to stabilize, arranging themselves into something almost comprehensible. Day 847. The temporal displacement increases with each transit. The ship exists simultaneously across multiple probability streams. Crew reports time dilation effects and paradoxical observations. Dr. Martinez insists we're still in our original timeline, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Day 849. Lost contact with the outside world. Radio frequencies appear to be shifting. The watches we collected from different time streams continue to function, each keeping time for a reality we can no longer reach. Day 851. The next transit approaches. We can feel it in the ship's structure, in the way the instruments respond to our touch. Some crew members claim they can see their other selves through the observation windows. I'm beginning to think they're right. The entries continued, describing phenomena that matched what I was experiencing but provided no explanation, no scientific framework that could contain the impossible reality of the Chronos. The final entry was dated 3 days ago, though the handwriting looked decades old. Day 853. The ship chooses who stays and who goes. Those who remain become part of the drift, existing across all timelines simultaneously. Those who leave, I'm not sure they ever truly leave. Perhaps they simply return to a timeline where the Chronos never existed. I pray that's true. The next transit begins in 23 minutes. I checked my watch automatically, forgetting it had stopped. But the chronometer on the laboratory wall showed 3:40, which meant, if the notebook was accurate, I had minutes before something happened that I didn't understand and couldn't control. The deck beneath my feet began to vibrate more intensely, and the humming from the ship's instruments rose in pitch. Through the impossible windows, I watched as the various versions of my boat began to fade, becoming translucent like photographs exposed to too much light. The ocean views themselves started to blur and shift, one bleeding into another until all 6 windows showed the same thing. A vast, empty sea under a sky that couldn't decide what color it wanted to be. The watches on deck went silent. In that moment of absolute quiet, I felt the Chronos beginning to move. Not through water, but through something far more fundamental. Time itself seemed to bend around the vessel, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I stood at a crossroads not just of space, but of possibility itself. I could feel my Mary Catherine calling to me from across the dimensional gap, her familiar diesel engine a heartbeat in another reality. But I could also feel the Chronos offering something else, a chance to exist everywhere and nowhere, to drift through all possible oceans under all possible skies. The corridor back to the deck stretched before me, but it flickered like a mirage, sometimes short enough to cross in seconds, sometimes extending into infinity. The watches had begun ticking again, but now they all showed the same impossible time, 25:61, and counting upward. I stood on trembling legs and began walking toward what I hoped was escape, though with each step I grew less certain of what escape even meant. Behind me, the laboratory windows showed my boat in a dozen different realities, and I couldn't tell which one was real, which one was home. The fog outside had thickened into something that wasn't quite fog anymore, something that moved with purpose and watched with intelligence I could feel pressing against my mind. As I reached the deck, I saw the Mary Catherine floating just beyond the rail, exactly where I'd left her. But there were other versions of her too, ghostly images superimposed like double-exposed photographs. In some she appeared newer, in others more weathered. In one disturbing vision she floated upside down, her hull scarred by impacts from something massive and tentacled. I grabbed the rail, preparing to leap back to my boat, but hesitated as a terrible thought occurred to me. Which version was real? Which Mary Catherine would take me home to a world where the Chronos was just another derelict, where time moved in one direction and the sea had only one face? The watches along the rail had synchronized now, all showing 26:99 and rising. I could feel the ship preparing for its next transit, could sense reality preparing to fracture once again. In moments, the Chronos would slip between the cracks of possibility, and I would have to choose: leap to my boat and hope I landed in the right reality, or remain aboard and drift forever through seas that existed only in the spaces between moments. I closed my eyes and jumped. I felt myself falling through cold air, then landing hard on familiar deck plates. The Mary Catherine's engine coughed to life under my hands, and I gunned her away from the research vessel without looking back, focusing only on the compass needle pointing toward what I prayed was home. But as the fog closed behind me, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of my own engine, running parallel to mine in the mist. And then another, and another. A dozen versions of the Mary Catherine fleeing through a dozen different seas, all of them real, all of them carrying a version of me back to a shore that might not exist. Now, 3 weeks later, I tell this story to anyone who will listen. though I'm never certain if the words I speak are the ones people hear. Sometimes my watch runs backward. Sometimes I see boats that aren't there crossing my wake. Sometimes I wake in my bunk and for a moment can't remember which timeline I'm in, which version of my life is real. The Coast Guard found no record of a research vessel named Kronos. They have no reports of a derelict in the coordinates I provided. According to them, I was never out of radio contact, never reported anything unusual. But late at night, when the fog rolls in and the ocean grows uncommonly still, I hear the ticking of impossible watches keeping time for realities that might have been. And I wonder if I really escaped the drift, or if I'm still aboard that ship, imagining a return to a world that exists only in the spaces between seconds, sailing forever through seas that refuse to choose just one way to be. Story 4. The radio crackled with static. As I adjusted the volume, Mike's voice barely cutting through the interference. Something about a report of an abandoned campsite up near Cataract Falls. Guests complaining about smoke without fire. I told him I'd check it out, though the clock on my dashboard already read 9:43 p.m. Another late-night call in the Smokies. Another reason to question why I'd taken this job 6 months ago. The headlights carved through the mountain darkness as I wound up the narrow trail, ancient hemlocks pressing close on either side like sentinels. The air conditioning couldn't quite mask the smell that had been building for the last mile. Wood smoke, thick and acrid, the kind that clings to your clothes for days. But there shouldn't be any fires tonight. The drought had us under strict restrictions, and I'd personally extinguished the last permitted campfire 3 days ago. I parked at the trailhead and grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through air so thick with smoke I could taste it. The scent triggered something primal in my chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the altitude. As I followed the trail markers, the smoke grew denser, though I couldn't see flames anywhere. My radio hissed with static, Mike's voice reduced to unintelligible fragments that sounded almost like whispers. The clearing opened before me like a wound in the forest, bathed in moonlight that seemed too bright, too cold. 3 perfect circles of ash dotted the ground, each maybe 6 feet across, their edges so precise they looked carved rather than burned. The ash was still warm. I could feel the heat radiating up through my boots even from several feet away, but there were no flames, no embers, no logical source for the smoke that continued to rise in thin, wavering columns. I knelt beside the nearest circle, training my flashlight on the gray powder. The ash was fine, almost flour-like, and completely uniform in texture. No charred wood fragments, no half-burned logs, nothing that suggested an actual fire had ever burned here. The warmth beneath it felt alive somehow, pulsing like a slow heartbeat against the soles of my feet. That's when I noticed the pattern in the smoke. The thin columns rising from each circle weren't dispersing randomly. They maintained their shape far longer than physics should allow, twisting upward in deliberate spirals before suddenly collapsing and reforming. And in those brief moments of collapse, just for a split second, the smoke seemed to take on familiar shapes. A shoulder here, the curve of a spine there, always just at the edge of recognition before dissolving back into formless vapor. I stood quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The movement must have disturbed something because all 3 smoke columns suddenly shifted, bending toward me like flowers following the sun. For one terrifying moment, I could swear I was looking at 3 gray silhouettes, each one perfectly mimicking my posture. Feet slightly apart, right hand holding a flashlight, left hand reaching toward my radio. The radio chose that moment to burst into clear reception, Mike's voice cutting through the static with startling clarity. "Danny, you copy? Found something weird in the archives about that location." I pressed the transmit button, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Go ahead, Mike." "Been digging through the old ranger logs. That clearing's got history, man. Been reports of strange fires there going back over a century. Always the same time, too. 11:17 p.m. Bunch of different dates, but always that exact time." The smoke columns had returned to their normal patterns, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me. "Any explanation in the logs?" "Nothing official. But there's this one entry from 1924. Guy named Henderson. Says he investigated a similar report and found the same thing you're describing. Ash circles, smoke without fire. But here's the weird part. Mike's voice took on an uncertain tone. Henderson's final log entry is dated the next morning, and all it says is, found new ash circle in clearing. Henderson's shift ended at 11:17 p.m. Like he was writing about himself in third person. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air ran down my spine. Mike, what time is it? 10:52. Why? 25 minutes. I had 25 minutes to get out of the clearing, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The logical part of my brain insisted this was all coincidence, that Mike was just trying to spook me with old stories. But the smoke columns had begun to move more deliberately now, bending and swaying in patterns that defied the still night air. I forced myself to walk the perimeter of the clearing, documenting what I saw, trying to maintain some semblance of professional routine. The ash circles were arranged in a perfect triangle, each one exactly 30 feet from the other two. The ground between them showed no signs of recent foot traffic, no indication that anyone had been here to light fires. Yet the warmth continued to radiate upward, and the smoke continued its impossible dance. Near the eastern edge of the clearing, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small metal plate, green with age, partially buried beneath decades of fallen leaves. I brushed it clean and read the engraved text by flashlight. R. Henderson, Park Ranger, 1919-1924. Below that, in smaller text, missing in the line of duty. My hands were shaking as I keyed the radio. Mike, I need you to look up Ranger Henderson again. What happened to him? The response took longer than it should have. When Mike's voice came back, it carried an edge of concern. Danny, according to these records, Henderson disappeared in September 1924. Last seen investigating reports of unauthorized fires near Cataract Falls. They never found a body. The smoke columns were definitely taller now, reaching 15 feet into the air before dissipating. And they weren't just mimicking my posture anymore. They were anticipating it. When I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, the smoke moved a split second before I did. When I raised my hand to wipe sweat from my forehead, the gray shapes lifted their arms first. Mike, I'm leaving the clearing now. I tried to sound calm, professional, but my voice cracked on the last word. Copy that. What's your ETA back to? The radio cut to static mid-sentence. I slapped it against my palm, adjusted the frequency, tried everything I could think of, but got nothing except the hiss of white noise that seemed to whisper my name in the spaces between the static. I turned toward the trail, but the smoke had other ideas. The three columns suddenly expanded, spreading outward like gray curtains that blocked my view of the forest beyond. I could still see the trail markers through the haze, but they seemed farther away than they should be, wavering like mirages in the desert heat. The first step toward the trailhead felt like walking through molasses. The air had become thick, resistant, pressing against me from all sides. My flashlight beam barely penetrated 3 feet into the smoke, and the familiar landmarks I'd used to navigate the trail seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. 10 minutes later, I was still in the clearing. I'd walked in what should have been a straight line toward the trail, but somehow I kept ending up back at the ash circles. Each time I tried to leave, the smoke would thicken, the air would grow heavier, and my sense of direction would become so muddled that I'd find myself standing exactly where I'd started. The ranger plate seemed to mock me from its bed of leaves, Henderson's name glinting in the moonlight. My watch read 11:09. 8 minutes. 8 minutes to figure out what Henderson couldn't. 8 minutes to break whatever pattern had claimed him, and who knew how many others. I forced myself to think like a ranger, to approach this as a problem with a solution. But every rational explanation crumbled against the evidence of my senses. The ash was definitely hotter now. I could feel it through my boots, a warmth that was starting to become uncomfortable. The smoke columns had grown thick as tree trunks, their movements more pronounced, more human. And in their gray depths, I was beginning to see details that shouldn't exist. The suggestion of faces, the outline of ranger uniforms, the glint of metal badges. 11:12. I ran for the tree line, crashing through the smoke barrier with desperate force. For a moment I thought I'd broken through. I could see the hemlocks ahead, dark and solid and real. But with my next step, the ground beneath my feet turned to ash, warm and soft and impossibly deep. I was sinking, the gray powder rising around my ankles, my knees, pulling me down into heat that was becoming painful. The smoke enveloped me completely, and in its embrace, I heard voices. Not whispers or moans, but normal conversation, the everyday chatter of men at work. Henderson's voice, describing warm ash circles and impossible smoke. Another ranger, from an earlier time, reporting the same phenomena in careful, measured tones. And others, dozens of others, all describing the same clearing, the same time, the same inevitable conclusion to their shifts. 11:15. I was back in the center of the clearing, though I had no memory of climbing out of the ash or walking here. The 3 circles glowed with their own light now, pulsing in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. The smoke had become solid, taking the shapes of rangers from across the decades, all of them wearing the familiar green uniform, all of them watching me with expressions of weary resignation. Henderson stepped forward, or maybe it was just the smoke that looked like Henderson. His face was kind, understanding, the face of a man who'd spent his last minutes trying to solve the same puzzle. "It's time, son," he said, though his voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like an echo in a vast cavern. "Your shift's almost over." 11:16. My radio crackled to life one last time, Mike's voice cutting through clearly. "Danny, you copy? We've got your GPS signal, but it's not moving. Everything okay out there?" I looked down at my watch, the second hand sweeping toward the 12. 59 seconds, 58, 57. My hand moved to the radio transmit button without my conscious decision, and I heard my own voice, calm and professional, delivering words I didn't choose. "Mike, I found something interesting in the clearing. Appears to be evidence of previous ranger activity. I'll file a full report when my shift ends." "Copy that, Danny. When are you heading back?" 30 seconds. "Shift ends at 11:17, I heard myself say. I'll radio you after that." 20 seconds. The smoke rangers nodded approvingly, their forms becoming more solid as the seconds ticked away. I could see their faces clearly now. Henderson and others I didn't recognize, all of them wearing expressions of peaceful acceptance. They'd been waiting so long for the next shift change, for someone else to take their place in the endless rotation of duty. 10 seconds. The warmth rose from the ash circles like a wave, washing over me with the comfort of coming home after a long day's work. My radio fell from nerveless fingers, and I felt my body beginning to lose its substance, becoming part of the pattern that had claimed so many before me. 5 seconds. My last coherent thought was a question. How many ash circles would there be tomorrow? But even as the transformation took hold, even as I felt myself becoming smoke and memory, a small part of my mind remained stubbornly analytical. The part that had become a ranger because I loved solving puzzles, understanding systems, finding the logic hidden in chaos. And in that final moment, I realized the terrible truth. This wasn't supernatural at all. The clearing was a trap, but not a mystical one. It was psychological, a perfect storm of suggestion and environmental factors that induced a shared delusion so powerful, it became reality for those caught within it. The warm ash wasn't magic. It was some kind of natural geothermal phenomenon, creating heat without fire. The smoke wasn't ghostly. It was gas venting from underground, creating visual distortions that the mind interpreted as familiar shapes. But the pattern, the 11:17 timing, the consistent reports across decades, that was the real horror. Each ranger who'd investigated had been primed by the previous reports, expectations shaping perception until the delusion became self-fulfilling prophecy. We'd convinced ourselves into becoming part of the pattern, our minds so thoroughly broken by suggestion and isolation that we'd literally thought ourselves out of existence. The last thing I saw was my watch face, the second hand finally reaching 12. 11:17 exactly. The next morning, Mike drove up to Cataract Falls to investigate Danny's last known location. The GPS tracker in the Ranger vehicle showed it had remained stationary all night, but Danny was nowhere to be found. In the clearing, Mike discovered 4 ash circles instead of 3, arranged in a perfect square. Each circle was cold to the touch, showing no sign of recent fire. Mike's report, filed later that day, noted the discovery of Danny's radio near the eastern edge of the clearing, along with a small metal plate bearing Henderson's name. He recommended the area be closed to further investigation pending a full search and rescue operation. But Mike never filed that report. His watch read 11:16 p.m. as he bent to examine the 4th ash circle, noting how warm it felt despite the lack of any visible fire. Behind him, thin columns of smoke began to rise, twisting in the still night air, forming shapes that looked remarkably like 2 men in Ranger uniforms, standing at attention, waiting for the next shift change. Story 5. And the knock came at 11:47 p.m., sharp and insistent against my apartment door. I'd been nursing a lukewarm beer and scrolling through my phone, the building's usual evening silence broken only by the occasional groan of old pipes and the distant hum of traffic from Powell Boulevard. Living in this converted warehouse in southeast Portland meant accepting certain quirks: drafty windows, thin walls, and neighbors who kept to themselves like hermits guarding secrets. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not Marcus from 3B. In the 8 months since I'd moved into 2A, we'd exchanged maybe a dozen words, mostly polite nods in the hallway or brief comments about packages left by the front door. He was a thin, pale man in his 40s, with the kind of hollow-eyed look that suggested too many late nights and too much caffeine. The type who worked remote tech jobs and ordered groceries online to avoid human contact. Through the peephole, I could see him shifting nervously from foot to foot, his breath visible in small puffs despite the October evening being unseasonably warm. His usually neat appearance looked disheveled, shirt wrinkled, hair mussed, and an expression that bordered on desperation. When I opened the door, the first thing that hit me was the heat. A wave of stifling air rolled down from the 3rd floor, thick and oppressive, like opening an oven door. It carried with it a metallic scent, sharp and coppery, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and slightly sweet, like overripe fruit left in the sun. Marcus's words tumbled out in a rush. His heater had malfunctioned, he explained, and the building's ancient radiator system was going haywire. The super wasn't answering his phone, and Marcus needed help accessing the main valve to shut everything down before the pipes burst or worse. He apologized profusely for the late hour, but insisted it was an emergency that couldn't wait until morning. The story made sense, sort of. Our building's heating system was a relic from the 1940s, a network of cast iron radiators and exposed pipes that clanged and hissed with the determination of a steam locomotive. I'd heard other tenants complain about temperature fluctuations and mechanical failures. What didn't make sense was why Marcus looked like he hadn't slept in days, or why his hands trembled as he gestured toward the stairwell. Still, being a decent neighbor seemed more important than my growing unease. I grabbed my toolkit, a pathetic collection of basic hardware store purchases, and followed him upstairs. The temperature increased with each step. By the time we reached the 3rd floor, my shirt was sticking to my back with perspiration. The hallway felt like a greenhouse in midsummer, the air thick and humid enough to make breathing laborious. The building's usually dry, Portland air had transformed into something tropical and suffocating. Marcus's apartment door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of interior that seemed to shimmer with heat distortion. As we approached, I could hear a sound from within, a rhythmic thumping, steady and deep, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the walls. Inside his apartment, the temperature became nearly unbearable. Every thermostat I could see was set to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, their digital displays glowing a cold blue that seemed almost mocking in the sweltering environment. The contradiction made no sense. According to every gauge and control, the apartment should have been freezing, yet the air felt like stepping into a sauna cranked to maximum heat. Marcus led me through his living room, which looked surprisingly normal aside from the oppressive temperature. Books lined built-in shelves, A modest couch faced a wall-mounted television, and a small dining table held the remnants of what appeared to be a hastily abandoned dinner. The only unusual element was how everything seemed slightly out of focus, as if the heat was creating a constant mirage effect that made objects waver at their edges. The sound grew louder as we moved deeper into the apartment, that steady, pulsing rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite mechanical, lacking the predictable precision of machinery, but it wasn't entirely organic either. The tempo was too slow for a human heartbeat, too irregular for a metronome, and too purposeful for random building noise. Marcus stopped at a narrow door near his kitchen, what looked like a utility closet or pantry. His hand hovered over the knob for a moment, and I noticed his fingers were shaking more violently now. He seemed to be gathering courage, or perhaps resignation, before turning to face me. The explanation he offered was rambling and disjointed, something about old pipes and pressure valves, about how the building's heating system had been jerry-rigged over the decades and now required manual intervention during malfunctions. He mentioned previous tenants who dealt with similar problems, and how there was a specific procedure that needed to be followed to prevent damage to the entire building's infrastructure. As he spoke, I found myself focusing more on his tone than his words. There was an undercurrent of pleading in his voice, a desperation that went beyond concern for broken pipes. His eyes kept darting between me and the closet door, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he was trying to convince himself as much as me. When he finally opened the door, the sound became overwhelming. The closet contained what appeared to be a section of the building's original heating system, a thick metal pipe that ran vertically through the space, disappearing into the ceiling above and floor below. But this wasn't the rusted iron I'd expected. The pipe looked newer, almost organic in its appearance, with a surface that seemed to shift between metallic silver and something deeper, darker. Its circumference was roughly that of a telephone pole, far larger than any heating pipe had a right to be. And it was pulsing. The entire length of visible pipe expanded and contracted with that rhythmic beating I'd been hearing, each pulse accompanied by a vibration that I could feel through the floor and into my bones. The metal surface rippled with each contraction, creating patterns that almost looked like veins or arteries beneath skin. Marcus watched my reaction carefully, gauging whether I was seeing what he was seeing or if the heat was making me hallucinate. The temperature in the closet was beyond anything I'd experienced. A dry, searing heat that made my lungs burn with each breath and caused sweat to evaporate almost instantly from my skin. He began explaining the procedure with increasing urgency. Someone needed to stay with the pipe, to monitor its rhythm and ensure it didn't become erratic. The previous tenant who'd lived here had done it for years before moving out suddenly 3 weeks ago. Since then, Marcus had been handling the responsibility, but the strain was becoming too much. He needed someone else to take a shift, just for tonight, just to give him a few hours of rest. The explanation felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced these words many times before, but underneath the mechanical delivery, I could hear genuine exhaustion and something else. Relief, perhaps, at the prospect of sharing this burden with someone else. As he spoke, I found myself staring at the pipe, mesmerized by its constant motion. The pulsing seemed to have a hypnotic quality, and I realized I'd been unconsciously synchronizing my breathing to its rhythm. Each time the pipe expanded, the temperature seemed to spike, creating waves of heat that rolled through the small space like invisible surf. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the pipe itself, but how natural it was beginning to feel. My initial shock was fading, replaced by a growing sense that this was simply how things were in this building, in this apartment, in this closet. The rational part of my mind that insisted this was impossible was being steadily overwhelmed by the undeniable reality of what I was experiencing. Marcus positioned me near the pipe, close enough that I could feel its warmth radiating against my skin. He showed me how to place my hand on its surface, surprisingly cool despite the ambient heat, and how to feel for changes in the pulse rate. Too fast or too slow, he explained, could indicate problems that might affect the entire building. The moment my palm made contact with the pipe, everything changed. The beating wasn't just something I could feel, it was something I could understand. Each pulse carried with it a sense of purpose, of need. of something vast and patient that existed just beyond the boundaries of normal perception. The pipe wasn't just metal and machinery, it was a conduit for something that defied easy categorization. Marcus's words became distant background noise as I focused on the sensations flowing through my hand and up my arm. The pipe was alive in ways that transcended biology, aware in ways that had nothing to do with consciousness as I understood it. It knew I was there, recognized my presence, and seemed to be evaluating whether I was suitable for whatever role Marcus was trying to pass along. Time became fluid in that overheated closet. Minutes or hours might have passed as I stood there, hand pressed against the pulsing surface, feeling myself becoming synchronized not just with its rhythm, but with its purpose. Marcus's voice faded to a whisper, then to silence, and I had the vague impression that he'd left the closet, possibly left the apartment entirely. The heat no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt necessary, like standing in the warming presence of something ancient and benevolent that required specific conditions to maintain its existence. My initial fear was dissolving, replaced by a growing sense of responsibility and protectiveness toward whatever was flowing through the pipe beneath my palm. When awareness returned, and I couldn't say how much time had passed, I found myself alone in the closet, still touching the pipe, still feeling its steady pulse. My shirt was soaked with perspiration, but I felt strangely refreshed, like waking from the most restful sleep of my life. The apartment beyond the closet door was silent and dark. No sign of Marcus, no indication of when he might return. The thermostat still read 0 degrees, the air still shimmered with impossible heat, and the pipe continued its eternal rhythm beneath my hand. I tried to step away, to leave the closet and return to my own apartment, but found myself reluctant to break the connection. Each time I lifted my hand from the pipe's surface, the temperature seemed to spike dangerously, and an overwhelming sense of urgency flooded through me. Something terrible would happen if I left. Something necessary would stop functioning. Something that the entire building, perhaps the entire neighborhood, depended upon would fail if I abandoned my post. The rational explanation was clear. Marcus had somehow drugged me, or I was experiencing a psychotic break, or the extreme heat was causing hallucinations. But the pipe beneath my palm felt undeniably real, and the responsibility I felt toward it seemed too important to dismiss as delusion. Hours passed, or perhaps days. The boundary between being awake and dreaming became increasingly meaningless. I found myself drifting in and out of awareness, always returning to find my hand still in place, the pipe still pulsing, the heat still radiating through the small space. During my more lucid moments, I tried to piece together what was happening. Had Marcus done this to the previous tenant? Was this some elaborate psychological experiment or cult recruitment technique? But these explanations felt thin and inadequate when confronted with the physical reality of the situation. The pipe was changing me, or perhaps revealing something that had always been there. I could feel my perception expanding, becoming more sensitive to the building's hidden rhythms and underlying currents. The heating system wasn't just moving air and water through pipes. It was maintaining something far more complex and essential. Other tenants passed through the building below, their footsteps and conversations filtering up through the floor, but they seemed distant and unimportant compared to the constant presence flowing beneath my palm. They went about their daily routines, unaware that their comfortable existence depended on someone standing vigil in a third-floor closet, monitoring the pulse of something that couldn't quite be classified as machine or organism. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to consider the possibility of leaving. But each time I tried to move away from the pipe, its rhythm would falter, becoming irregular and weak, and the temperature would spike to levels that felt genuinely dangerous. Whatever was flowing through the metal conduit needed constant attention, needed someone to serve as an anchor or regulator for its function. The realization came gradually. This wasn't a temporary emergency or favor for a neighbor. This was a permanent responsibility, a role that couldn't be abandoned without consequences I didn't fully understand, but instinctively knew would be catastrophic. As consciousness faded once again, I wondered if Marcus was somewhere else in the building, finally getting the rest he'd been craving, confident that he'd successfully passed along his burden to someone new. Or perhaps he was still nearby, watching to ensure I didn't try to escape before fully accepting my new role as guardian. The distinction between reality and hallucination had become meaningless. Whether the pipe was supernatural, technological, or psychological didn't matter as much as the undeniable fact that it needed me, and I was apparently the only person currently available to provide what it required. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear my phone ringing in my apartment below, but the sound seemed to come from another world entirely. My old life was becoming a memory, replaced by something far more immediate and essential. The pipe pulsed beneath my palm, steady and eternal, and I felt myself settling into my new role with a mixture of resignation and strange contentment. After all, someone had to stand guard. Someone had to maintain the rhythm. Someone had to ensure that whatever flowed through the building's hidden arteries continued flowing, keeping the delicate balance that allowed normal life to continue in the apartments below. The heat no longer felt oppressive. It felt like coming home. Story 6. The engine died with a shudder that seemed to echo through the canyon walls long after the Corolla had rolled to a complete stop. I turned the key again. Nothing. The dashboard lights flickered once, then went dark, leaving us with only the dying light of late afternoon filtering through dust-caked windows. "What's wrong?" Sarah's voice carried that edge it always got when things went sideways, the same tone she'd used when I'd suggested taking this route instead of the interstate. I pumped the gas pedal, knowing it was useless. The smell of overheated metal drifted through the vents, mixing with the desert sage that seemed to permeate everything out here. Highway 50, the loneliest road in America, they called it. Now I understood why. "Probably the alternator," I said, though I had no idea what I was talking about. Cars weren't my thing. Numbers were my thing. Spreadsheets and quarterly reports and the controlled environment of air-conditioned offices. Out here, with the vast emptiness of Nevada stretching in every direction, and the sun beginning its descent behind jagged canyon walls, I felt as useful as the dead engine. Sarah shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming against the armrest in that rapid-fire pattern that meant her anxiety was spiking. We'd been driving for 6 hours, trying to make it to her sister's wedding in Reno, and now we were stranded in what looked like the set of a post-apocalyptic movie. I tried my phone. No signal, naturally. The little bars that had been my lifeline to civilization had vanished somewhere around Austin, Nevada, and hadn't returned. "There's got to be a tower or something around here," I said, more to myself than to her. Emergency beacon, ranger station, something. I scanned the horizon through the windshield. To our left, the highway stretched away into shimmering heat mirages. To our right, the land rose in broken ridges toward what looked like a fire lookout tower, its metal frame silhouetted against the orange sky like the skeleton of some ancient creature. "I'm going to check that tower," I said, pointing. "Maybe there's a radio, or at least enough height to get a signal." Sarah's drumming stopped. "You're leaving me here?" "Just for a few minutes. Lock the doors, keep the windows cracked. I'll be right back." I could see her working through the alternatives in her head, the way she always did when faced with a choice between bad and worse. Finally, she nodded, but her eyes had that wide, startled look they got when she felt trapped. The heat hit me like a physical blow when I stepped outside. The air tasted of dust and something metallic, like old pennies. My shoes crunched on gravel as I started up the slope, following what might have been a trail, or might have been just a natural break in the scrub brush. The tower grew larger as I climbed, its metal legs planted deep in concrete footings that had cracked and shifted over the years. Up close, I could see rust blooming along the joints, and several of the ladder rungs looked questionable at best. But there was definitely a structure at the top, a small cabin with windows that caught the last rays of sunlight. I tested the first rung. It held, though it sang slightly under my weight, a metallic note that seemed to hang in the still air longer than it should have. The climb was longer than I'd expected, each step bringing me higher above the desert floor, higher above Sarah and the dead car that looked increasingly small and vulnerable in the growing twilight. By the time I reached the cabin at the top, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands were shaking from gripping the rungs. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar on hinges that protested with a groan when I pushed it open. The cabin was a time capsule from the 1970s, wood-paneled walls, a desk covered in yellowed paperwork, and a massive radio console that looked like something from a submarine. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the doorway, and the whole place smelled like old coffee and cigarettes. I tried the radio first, flipping switches and turning dials, but nothing happened. The power was out naturally. Then I noticed the cable running from the back of the console to a hole in the floor, a power line leading down to what must be a generator somewhere in the tower's base. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just wind through the metal framework, or maybe the settling sounds of an old structure. But as I stood there, frozen, I realized it was voices, distorted and crackling with static, but definitely voices, coming from the radio, which wasn't plugged in. I leaned closer to the silent console, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. The voices were getting clearer, filtering up through the dead speakers like whispers from the bottom of a well. Probably the alternator, my own voice said, tinny and distant. I jerked back from the console, nearly knocking over a chair. But the voices continued, playing out our conversation from just minutes before, down to Sarah's nervous finger drumming, and the way I'd tried to sound confident when I'd mentioned the tower. "There's got to be a tower or something around here," Radio Me said. "Emergency beacon, ranger station, something." The static grew thicker, warping our words until they sounded like they were being spoken underwater. But underneath the distortion, I could hear something else. A rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on metal stairs. The tower shuddered. It was subtle at first, just a tremor that I might have dismissed as wind. But as Radio Me explained my plan to check the tower, the vibration grew stronger, traveling up through the metal framework and into the cabin floor. The empty coffee mug on the desk began to rattle. "I'm going to check that tower," the radio continued, and the word tower stretched and distorted until it became something else entirely, something that made my teeth ache. The footsteps were getting louder. I pressed my face to the cabin window, looking down the length of the tower toward the ground. The ladder was empty, but the vibrations continued, as if something heavy was climbing up from below, something that cast no shadow and made no sound except for that rhythmic creaking that seemed to sync with my pulse. "David," Radio Sarah said, her voice fracturing into digital artifacts. "David, David, David." Each repetition of my name sent a stronger tremor through the structure. The coffee mug fell to the floor, shattering into pieces that scattered across the wooden planks. I gripped the windowsill, my knuckles white, as the cabin swayed like a ship in rough seas. The power line. I had to get to the generator, had to restart the power so I could send a distress call. But first I had to get the radio to stop playing, had to prevent it from reaching whatever it was trying to say next. Because underneath Sarah's fractured repetition of my name, I could hear something else building, another voice that sounded like me but wasn't quite right. The tone was off, the cadence wrong, as if someone was trying to imitate my speech patterns, but couldn't quite get them right. "He will," the false me began, and the entire tower lurched. I lunged for the radio console, frantically searching for an off switch, a power button, anything. But the controls were labeled in faded text I couldn't read in the growing darkness, and my hands were shaking too badly to work with any precision. The real Sarah, the one still sitting in the car far below, had to be wondering where I was. How long had I been up here? It felt like hours, but the light outside suggested only minutes had passed. Time seemed to move differently in the cabin, stretching and compressing like the voices from the radio. "We'll stay," the not me voice continued, and I realized with growing horror what it was trying to say. "He will stay, he will stay, he will..." I had to get out, had to get down to the generator and restore power to the real radio, the one that could actually send a distress signal. But the footsteps on the ladder were getting closer, and I didn't want to face whatever was climbing toward me in the darkness between the metal rungs. The cabin had another window on the opposite side, overlooking the back of the tower where a maintenance ladder led down to a small shed built into the rocky hillside. The generator housing, most likely. I could bypass whatever was coming up the main ladder, restart the power, and get back to Sarah before what? I didn't want to finish that thought. I pushed open the back window, wincing as its hinges shrieked in protest. The maintenance ladder looked even more precarious than the main one, with several rungs missing entirely, and rust flakes falling like snow with each gust of wind. But it was my only option. The radio behind me continued its mechanical repetition, my name and Sarah's blending into a chorus of static and electronic distortion. The tower was shaking continuously now, a tremor that traveled from the ground up through the metal frame and into my bones. I swung my leg over the windowsill and felt for the first rung with my foot. The metal was ice cold despite the desert heat, and rough with corrosion that bit into my palms as I lowered myself down. Each step took me further from the cabin and its impossible radio, but also closer to whatever was generating the vibrations that made the entire structure sing like a tuning fork. The generator shed was smaller than I'd expected, barely large enough for the industrial unit that squatted inside like a sleeping beast. The door was propped open with a rock, and the smell of diesel fuel hung heavy in the still air. A control panel covered in switches and gauges was mounted on the near wall, and everything looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of routine maintenance. I found the main power switch easily enough, a large red toggle clearly labeled on-off in block letters. But as I reached for it, the radio voices from the cabin above grew suddenly clear, as if the distance had somehow improved the reception instead of degrading it. "David?" It was Sarah's voice, but not the static, corrupted version from the radio. This was clearer, more immediate. "David, where are you?" I froze with my hand on the switch. That wasn't coming from the radio. That was coming from outside, from the direction of the car. I moved to the shed's doorway and peered around the frame. Far below, illuminated by the last rays of sunlight, I could see our Corolla sitting exactly where I'd left it, but Sarah was no longer inside. She was standing beside the open driver's door, looking up toward the tower, her hand shading her eyes. "David!" she called again, and her voice carried clearly across the distance. The car started. "We can go." Relief flooded through me, so intense it made my knees weak. The car was running. We could get out of here, could drive to the nearest town and laugh about this whole bizarre experience over dinner. I started to wave, to call back to her, but something made me pause. The radio in the cabin above was still playing, still cycling through its distorted loop of our conversation. But if the car was running, if Sarah was outside calling to me, then when had the radio recorded our voices? We'd had that conversation while the car was dead, while the electrical system was completely dark. Unless the radio hadn't recorded anything at all. Unless what I was hearing was something else entirely. I looked up at the cabin windows, now glowing faintly with some internal light source I couldn't identify. The radio voices continued their endless cycle, building toward that phrase I couldn't let them complete. But mixed in with the static, I could hear something new, breathing that wasn't quite right, air being drawn in and expelled by something that might not have lungs. "David," Sarah called again, but this time her voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. "Come down. We have to go now." The urgency in her tone was wrong, too sharp, too desperate. The Sarah I knew would be annoyed at my absence, maybe worried, but she wouldn't sound panicked unless something was seriously wrong. And the car starting by itself after a complete electrical failure, that wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. I backed deeper into the generator shed, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. The radio upstairs was playing our conversation from a car that couldn't have been recording anything. Sarah was calling to me from below, but the urgency in her voice suggested she was running from something rather than simply wanting to leave, and the footsteps on the ladder had never stopped. The generator beside me was connected to the radio upstairs by more than just a power cable. I could see other lines running up through the shed's ceiling, antenna feeds, maybe data cables. This wasn't just a backup power source. It was part of some larger system I didn't understand, a system that had been waiting for someone to climb the tower, someone to hear the recordings, someone to complete the circuit. "He will stay," the false me voice whispered from the radio above, clearer now, more insistent. "He will stay, he will stay." I had to make a choice. flip the switch and restore power to the radio, giving me the ability to send a real distress call but also allowing the system to complete whatever process it had started. Or leave the power off and find another way down. Find another way to reach Sarah and the mysteriously functioning car. But as I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, I realized that the choice might not be mine to make. The breathing sounds from the cabin above were getting louder, and the metal framework of the tower was beginning to resonate with a frequency that made my ears ring. Something was coming down the maintenance ladder behind me. I could hear it now, the careful placement of weight on corroded rungs, the whisper of fabric against metal. But when I turned to look through the shed's rear window, the ladder appeared empty, just vertical lines of shadow against the darkening sky. The radio voices were building to a crescendo, my name and Sarah's blending into something that no longer sounded like language at all. And underneath it all, that persistent phrase trying to complete itself, trying to establish some kind of linguistic lock that would hold me here permanently. He will stay in the... I slammed my palm down on the power switch. The generator roared to life with a diesel growl that drowned out everything else. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the shed, and somewhere above me, the radio console was finally receiving real power. I had maybe 30 seconds before the system fully initialized. 30 seconds to get to the radio and send a genuine distress call before whatever process I'd interrupted could resume. I burst from the shed and scrambled up the maintenance ladder, taking the rungs 3 at a time. The metal sang under my weight, harmonizing with the generator's rumble in a way that seemed almost musical. Behind me, I could hear something else ascending, something that moved with the fluid grace of water flowing upward. The cabin windows blazed with light as I hauled myself through the back window. The radio console was alive now, displays glowing and indicators blinking in complex patterns. I grabbed the microphone and started transmitting on what I hoped was an emergency frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is..." The radio cut me off with a burst of static that resolved into perfect clarity. David Martin, stranded on Highway 50 near mile marker 247. Car broke down approximately... It was my voice, but I hadn't spoken those words. The radio was generating them, pulling information from sources I couldn't identify, creating a distress call that sounded exactly like something I would say. "Traveling with passenger Sarah Chen, require immediate assistance. Will remain at fire tower coordinates." "No," I whispered, reaching for the microphone's cord. But the radio continued broadcasting, overriding any attempt I made to interrupt. "Will remain at coordinates until rescue arrives. David Martin will stay at the tower. David Martin will stay. He will stay. He will..." I yanked the microphone cable from its socket, but the transmission continued. The radio had everything it needed now: power, antenna access, and a voice sample comprehensive enough to generate any message it required. It was sending out a distress call that would bring rescue teams to this exact location, teams that would find an empty car and no trace of the people who had supposedly sent the signal, except for whoever stayed behind to greet them. The footsteps on the main ladder had reached the cabin level. I could hear them just outside the door, patient and measured, waiting for me to complete my part of the process. The radio continued its endless loop, broadcasting my voice to every emergency frequency in the state, promising rescue teams that David Martin would be waiting at the tower coordinates. I looked out the front window toward the car. Sarah was still there, still calling to me, but now I could see that she wasn't alone. There were other figures moving around the Corolla, shapes that flickered in and out of visibility like heat mirages. They moved with the same patient, measured gait as whatever was waiting outside the cabin door. The radio had been broadcasting for a long time, I realized. Not just tonight, but for years, maybe decades. Each transmission drew new travelers to this stretch of highway, new voices to add to its collection, new people to staff its ever-growing network of impossible rescue scenarios. And I had just added my voice to its repertoire. The cabin door opened with a creak that harmonized perfectly with the radio static. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what combination of features it had assembled from all the travelers who had climbed this tower before me, all the people who had thought they were sending distress calls but had actually been recording audition tapes. Instead, I looked out at the highway, at the endless stretch of asphalt that had drawn Sarah and me into this trap. In the distance, I could see headlights approaching, the first of the rescue teams, responding to a distress call that promised them a grateful survivor waiting at easily identifiable coordinates. The radio continued broadcasting in my voice, assuring the approaching rescuers that David Martin was safe at the tower, that David Martin would remain at the tower, that David Martin would be there to guide them to the next phase of their own impossible journeys. And in the growing darkness outside, Sarah had stopped calling my name and started calling theirs. The pattern was complete. The system was operational. And somewhere in the distance, another car was beginning to experience engine trouble on the loneliest road in America. Story 7. The rain hammered my windshield like 1,000 angry fists, each drop exploding into fractured silver before the wipers swept them away. I should have turned back hours ago when the storm warning started crackling through the radio, but Mrs. Henderson needed her medication tonight. 87 years old and living alone, some deliveries can't wait for better weather. Now I was paying for that choice. My GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving me to navigate Ohio's back roads by memory and hope. The familiar landmarks had vanished behind walls of rain so thick my headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. Every turn looked the same in the darkness. Asphalt disappearing into nothing, flanked by cornfields that rustled with sounds that weren't quite wind. I'd been driving in circles. I was sure of it now. The same broken mailbox had passed my window 3 times, its wooden post leaning at an angle that made it look like a crooked finger pointing into the storm. But that was impossible. I'd been following the road straight ahead, never making a U-turn, never even stopping except for the brief moment when I'd tried to call dispatch and found no signal bars. The engine coughed. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the delivery van shuddered through another pothole deep enough to jar my teeth. The cargo in the back, insulin, blood pressure pills, heart medication, rattled against the metal walls like bones in a coffin. That's when I saw the light. It cut through the rain ahead, steady and orange, like a lantern hanging from something I couldn't see. As I drew closer, the glow resolved into the neon outline of a gas station sign, half the letters dark, spelling UEL in flickering amber. The building beneath it squatted like a wounded animal, windows boarded up, pumps removed, leaving only concrete islands in a sea of cracked asphalt. But someone was there. A figure stood beneath the metal canopy where the pumps used to be, perfectly dry despite the rain that pounded everything else. He held something in his hand. A flashlight, I thought at first, until I noticed how the beam moved with deliberate precision, sweeping back and forth across the ground like he was searching for something. I pulled into the station and rolled down my window, rain immediately spattering my face and arms. The man looked up at the sound of my engine, and I caught a glimpse of his features in my headlights. Thin face, deep-set eyes, and a smile that seemed too wide for the circumstances. "Lost?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm's roar. "Yeah," I shouted back. "Need to get back to Route 50. GPS is dead." He stepped closer to my window, and I noticed something odd about the flashlight in his hand. The beam it cast was different from any I'd seen. Not white or yellow, but a pale blue that seemed to glow from within itself. And the rain. The rain didn't touch the light. Drops fell through the beam without disturbing it, as if the illumination existed in some space the storm couldn't reach. "I can guide you," he said. His voice was closer now, though I didn't remember him moving. "Follow my light. Don't lose sight of it no matter what." Something in his tone made my skin crawl, but what choice did I have? I was already late, already lost, and the storm was getting worse. Through my rearview mirror, I could see the rain coming down so hard it looked like static on an old television. "How far is it?" I asked. But when I turned back, he was already walking away, the strange blue light sweeping across the wet asphalt. Where the beam touched the ground, it left marks, not exactly marks, but impressions, like arrows drawn in light that lingered for a heartbeat before fading. They pointed deeper into the darkness, away from the abandoned station. I followed. The first few minutes seemed normal enough. The blue light bobbed ahead of me, staying just within range of my headlights. and the arrows it cast on the road were clear and consistent, pointing toward what I hoped was civilization. But gradually, I began to notice things that didn't make sense. The road beneath my tires felt different, smoother than it should have been, like fresh asphalt. But when I glanced in my side mirrors, I couldn't see anything behind me except darkness. Not the rain-soaked darkness of a stormy night, but absolute black, as if the road simply ended a few feet past my bumper. I tried to shake off the unease. Optical illusion, I told myself. The storm was playing tricks with light and shadow. But when I looked ahead again, the blue beam was drawing more than just arrows now. Symbols appeared in its wake. Spirals, lines that bent at impossible angles, shapes that hurt to look at directly. My hands began to sweat on the steering wheel. The man with the light never looked back, never acknowledged my presence beyond that initial conversation. He walked with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Even though the path he was leading me down had diverged from any road I recognized, we'd left the asphalt behind somewhere in the darkness, and now my tires crunched over gravel, then something softer that might have been dirt, or might have been something else entirely. I reached for the radio, hoping to catch a weather update, some anchor point to reality. Static filled the van, but underneath the white noise I thought I heard voices. Multiple voices, all talking at once in a language that sounded almost familiar but not quite. I twisted the dial, searching for a clear station, but the voices followed me across every frequency. They were getting louder. I snapped the radio off and immediately regretted it. The silence that followed was worse than the static. Now there was only the sound of my engine, the crunch of gravel under my tires, and something else. A rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the van itself. The windshield began to fog. At first I thought it was just the temperature difference between the inside and outside air. But as I reached for the defroster, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The condensation wasn't random. Letters were forming in the moisture, drawn by an invisible finger from the inside. Don't stop. I jerked my hand back from the controls, staring at the words as they slowly faded. A new message appeared below them. Don't look back. And then in larger letters that covered half the windshield. Don't lose the light. My foot found the brake pedal instinctively, but before I could apply pressure, more words appeared. You know what happens if you do. But I didn't know. I had no idea what would happen if I stopped, if I looked back, if I lost sight of that blue light that continued to dance ahead of me like a will-o'-the-wisp. All I knew was that the messages on my windshield felt like warnings from someone who cared about my survival, or threats from someone who didn't. The gravel road had become a dirt path, and now even that was growing uncertain. My headlights illuminated patches of ground that looked wrong, too soft, too dark, with a texture that reminded me of wet clay. The blue light ahead remained constant, but the symbols it traced were becoming more complex, more alien. They writhed across the earth like living things, pulsing with their own inner radiance. I checked my fuel gauge, 3/4 full. I'd started the night with a full tank, which meant I'd either been driving for much longer than I thought, or the van was consuming gas at an impossible rate. Neither option offered much comfort. The tapping inside the van grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the cargo area, where Mrs. Henderson's medication rattled with each bump and turn. But the sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful to be random movement. It was almost like Morse code, if Morse code could be tapped out by someone who didn't quite understand how fingers worked. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror and immediately wished I hadn't. There was nothing behind me. Not darkness, not rain, not the faintest trace of the path I'd traveled. Just an absence so complete it seemed to press against the back of my van like a physical weight. The road, the tracks, even the ground itself simply wasn't there anymore. It was as if I was driving through space, following a thread of light across an endless void. My breathing became shallow, rapid. The logical part of my mind insisted this was impossible, that roads didn't disappear, that space couldn't simply cease to exist. But the evidence was right there in my mirror, undeniable and terrifying. I forced myself to look forward again, to focus on the blue light, to follow the guidance I'd been given. What choice did I have? Even if I wanted to turn around, and the growing panic in my chest was screaming at me to do exactly that, there was nowhere to turn around to. The path behind me had been erased, leaving only the uncertain journey ahead. The man with the light had stopped. He stood perhaps 50 feet ahead. The beam of his flashlight pointed straight down at the ground. In its glow, I could see that the dirt path had ended. Beyond him stretched something that might have been grass, or might have been nothing at all. A flat expanse that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. I brought the van to a halt and waited, engine idling, unsure what was expected of me. The man didn't move, didn't signal, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. He simply stood there, holding his light steady, as if waiting for something. The tapping in the back of the van stopped. In the sudden silence, I became aware of other sounds, distant and faint, but unmistakably there. Whispers that seemed to come from the ground itself, speaking words in that same, almost familiar language I'd heard on the radio. And underneath the whispers, a low humming that vibrated through the van's frame and into my bones. The windshield began fogging again. This time the message appeared slowly, each letter forming with deliberate care. You've arrived. But arrived where? I looked around desperately, searching for any landmark, any sign of civilization. The blue light illuminated nothing but empty ground stretching away into darkness. There was no Route 50, no road home, no destination that made any sense. A new message formed on the glass. Get out. My hand shook as I gripped the steering wheel. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to leave the van, not to step out into that inexplicable darkness. But the alternative, sitting here forever, trapped between a void behind me and an unknown ahead, seemed equally impossible. The man with the light turned around. His face was the same as before, thin, ordinary, human. But his eyes reflected the blue glow of his flashlight like mirrors. When he smiled, I realized his teeth were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Time to make your delivery, he said, and though he stood 50 feet away, his voice sounded like it was coming from inside my own head. I looked down at the cargo manifest clipped to my dashboard. Mrs. Henderson's name was still there, along with her address on Maple Street. But as I watched, the letters began to shift and rearrange themselves, forming new words, a new destination, the crossroads between. And below that, in handwriting I didn't recognize, but somehow knew, was my own. Payment due upon delivery. The tapping resumed in the back of the van, but now it sounded different. Not like objects moving, but like something knocking from the outside, trying to get in. Or maybe like something inside, trying to get out. I reached for the door handle, my hand moving without conscious thought. The metal was cold against my palm, colder than it should have been given the warm night air. As I pulled the handle, the blue light ahead began to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The man was walking toward me now, his feet making no sound on the uncertain ground. The light in his hand cast new symbols with each step, symbols that looked increasingly like letters, like words, like a message spelled out in an alphabet I was only now beginning to understand. The windshield fogged one final time. Welcome home. But I'd never been here before. I was sure of that, even as something deep in my memory suggested otherwise, even as the whispers from the ground began to sound less foreign and more like voices I'd heard in dreams I couldn't quite remember. I opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was warm and dry, despite the storm I'd driven through to get here. Above me, stars shone through what should have been cloud cover, arranged in patterns that belonged to no sky I'd ever seen. The ground beneath my feet felt solid enough, but when I looked down, I couldn't see my own shadow. The man with the light stopped just beyond arm's reach. Up close, I could see that his flashlight wasn't a flashlight at all, but something older, something that pulsed with its own inner life. The blue glow it cast revealed details I hadn't noticed before. Symbols carved into the ground at my feet. A perfect circle surrounding the van, lines radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. You've been here before, he said, and his voice was gentler now, almost kind. You just forgot, like they all do, but the roads remember. The crossroads especially, remember. I wanted to deny it, to insist that this was my first time anywhere near this place, whatever this place was. But as I looked around, details began to seem familiar. The shape of that distant hill, the way the grass bent in the windless air, the particular quality of silence that pressed against my eardrums. "What am I delivering?" I asked, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. He gestured toward the van with his strange light. "Look for yourself." I walked to the back doors, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cargo area was exactly as I'd left it. Medical supplies in labeled boxes, everything secure and properly refrigerated. But when I read the labels again, the names had changed. Not Mrs. Henderson's medication, but packages addressed to people I'd never heard of, in places that didn't exist on any map. Except one name was familiar. My own name, printed in block letters on a small box I didn't remember loading. The return address was listed as my own apartment, but the destination was simply marked current location. Inside the box was a single item, a flashlight identical to the one the man carried, its blue glow pulsing gently in the darkness. "Some deliveries take longer than others," he said from behind me. "Some routes are more complicated, but everyone finds their way here eventually. The crossroads call to us all sooner or later." I lifted the flashlight from the box and immediately understood the weight of it, the way the light responded to my touch, the symbols that began appearing wherever I pointed it. It was all familiar because I'd done this before, not just once but many times, in ways that existed just beyond the reach of memory. "How many?" I asked. "Drivers?" He considered the question. "Hard to say. Time works differently here. Could be dozens, could be hundreds. But you're the first to ask that question. Most just accept the route and start walking." I looked back at the van, already knowing what I would see. The vehicle was fading, becoming translucent, the metal and glass losing substance with each passing moment. Soon it would be gone entirely, leaving only the crossroads and the choice ahead. "Where does the route lead?" "That depends," he said, "on who needs guidance next." The blue light in my hand pulsed, and I knew he was right. Somewhere out there, another driver was lost in another storm, following roads that existed only when someone needed them to exist. Somewhere out there, someone was about to make the same choice I had made, to trust a stranger with a light, to follow guidance into the unknown. The man who had guided me here smiled one last time, then began walking away, his own light already dimming as mine grew brighter. "The shift change is always the hardest part," he called back. "But you'll remember how it works. You always do." I watched him disappear into the darkness between the stars, and then I was alone at the crossroads with my light and my choice. Behind me, the van finished fading, taking with it the last connection to the world I thought I knew. Ahead of me stretched an infinite network of paths, each one leading to someone who needed to find their way. I started walking, the blue beam sweeping across ground that existed only when someone was lost enough to need it. And as I walked, I began to remember, not just this place, but all the other times I'd stood here, all the other storms I'd guided people through, all the other nights I'd forgotten by morning. The crossroads between what is and what needs to be. The place where all lost things eventually find themselves. The route that never ends, but always leads home. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of an engine struggling through a storm. Story 8. The heat shimmers rose from the asphalt like ghosts, distorting the horizon where Interstate 15 stretched endlessly through Utah's stark landscape. My cruiser's air conditioning wheezed against the afternoon sun, a mechanical death rattle that had been growing worse each day. The radio crackled with routine chatter, speeding violations, fender benders, the mundane pulse of law enforcement that had become the soundtrack to my life. I'd been patrolling this stretch for 8 years, knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every place where kids like to race their father's cars after midnight. The routine had become a meditation, almost religious in its predictability, until the sedan appeared in my rearview mirror, moving at precisely the speed limit, maintaining perfect lane discipline, and somehow feeling completely wrong. The driver's behavior triggered every instinct I'd developed over nearly a decade on the force. Not the obvious wrongness of a drunk weaving between lanes or a nervous teenager gripping the wheel too tightly, but something subtler. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the sweltering heat. I followed for 3 miles before activating my lights. The sedan pulled over immediately. No hesitation, no sudden acceleration, no desperate search for an exit ramp. It simply glided to the shoulder with mechanical precision, as if the driver had been expecting this moment. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the vehicle, hand resting on my radio out of habit. The driver's window was already down. A man in his 40s sat perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead. His clothes were unremarkable. Khaki pants, blue button-down shirt, the kind of outfit 1,000 office workers wore every day. But his stillness was absolute, unnatural. Even nervous drivers fidgeted, adjusted mirrors, glanced in their rear view. This man might as well have been carved from stone. When I asked for his license and registration, he spoke without turning his head, his voice carrying an odd echo as if coming from very far away. He told me his documents were in the glove compartment, that he'd been driving this route for reasons he couldn't quite explain, and that I should check the trunk before letting him go. The words sent ice through my veins despite the desert heat. In 8 years, no driver had ever volunteered for me to search their vehicle. The smart ones stayed quiet and hoped for a warning. The guilty ones made excuses or tried to distract. No one ever invited deeper scrutiny. But this man's suggestion felt less like an invitation and more like an instruction. As I walked toward the rear of the vehicle, my radio suddenly filled with static, then silence. The normal chatter that provided a constant background to my workday simply stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch somewhere far away. The silence felt thick, oppressive, like the moment before thunder breaks. The trunk lock clicked open at my touch, though I hadn't inserted the key the driver had given me. The lid rose slowly, and what I found inside defied every rational explanation my mind could construct. My service jacket lay folded with military precision, the name tag clearly visible, Reynolds. The same jacket I'd left hanging in my bedroom closet that morning. The same jacket that should have been 90 miles away in my apartment in Salt Lake City. The fabric still held the faint scent of my cologne. The same small coffee stain on the left cuff that had been bothering me for weeks. Beside it sat a police radio, identical to the one clipped to my belt, but this one was active, humming with electronic life. The LED display showed a frequency I didn't recognize, numbers that seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. Static emerged from the speaker, then gradually resolved into a voice. My own voice. The transmission was giving orders to return to my patrol car, to continue north on the interstate, to watch for a particular mile marker. The voice carried my inflections, my slight southern accent that 8 years in Utah hadn't quite erased. But there was something else in the tone, a flatness, an absence of the small hesitations and verbal tics that make each person's speech unique. I stood frozen in the desert heat, staring at evidence that shouldn't exist, listening to instructions from someone who sounded exactly like me but wasn't. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Elaborate prank, identity theft, some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by stress and isolation. But the jacket still smelled like my cologne, and the radio kept transmitting in my voice. The driver spoke again without turning around, his words drifting back to me with that same strange echo. He claimed to be a messenger, delivering warnings about events that hadn't happened yet, crimes that existed only in the spaces between seconds. His explanation made no sense, but neither did anything else about this encounter. I found myself walking back to my cruiser as the radio had instructed, though I couldn't remember making the conscious decision to move. My legs carried me forward while my mind struggled to process what was happening. The desert around me seemed to shimmer with more than just heat, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. The transmission continued, providing specific directions that led me deeper into the wasteland of central Utah. Mile marker 247, exit 162. A rest stop that I was certain hadn't existed when I'd driven this route that morning. Each instruction arrived in my own voice, but with that unsettling lack of humanity, as if someone had recorded me speaking and then stripped away everything that made the words mine. As I drove, following directions from myself, the landscape outside began to feel wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The mountains on the horizon seemed closer than they should be, their peaks sharper against the sky. The shadows fell at angles that didn't match the position of the sun. Other vehicles passed me, but when I tried to look directly at them, they seemed to flicker like mirages. The radio continued its bizarre instructions, and I found myself following them with increasing unease. Part of me wanted to throw the device out the window, to turn around and drive back to the station to report what had happened. But a stronger part, a part that felt less and less like me with each passing mile, insisted on following the route. The rest stop appeared exactly where the radio had indicated it would be, though I was certain it hadn't been there during my morning patrol. The building looked decades old, its paint faded by years of desert sun, but the parking lot was fresh blacktop without a crack or weed in sight. A handful of cars sat in the spaces, their occupants invisible behind tinted windows. I parked and sat in my cruiser, engine running, air conditioning fighting the heat while the radio continued its monotone instructions. The next phase, it told me in my own voice, would require me to approach the building and retrieve a package from locker 42. The package would contain everything I needed to understand what was happening. The walk across the parking lot felt like crossing an ocean. Each step took tremendous effort, as if I was moving through invisible resistance. The air itself seemed thicker here, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The other vehicles remained occupied but motionless, their passengers as still as mannequins. Inside the rest stop, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a frequency that seemed to match the strange radio transmission. The building was larger inside than it had appeared from the parking lot, corridors stretching away into darkness despite the abundance of artificial light. The familiar sounds of a rest stop, vending machines humming, restroom doors swinging, travelers talking, were completely absent. Locker 42 stood open, waiting for me. Inside was another radio, this one smaller, more compact, but displaying the same shifting frequency numbers. A note was taped to its back, written in handwriting that looked disturbingly similar to my own. The message was brief. The frequency allows communication across probability. You are receiving instructions from the version of yourself that made different choices. Follow them, or become the version that sends them. The words made no sense, but they filled me with a terror more profound than anything I'd experienced in 8 years of law enforcement. I'd seen car accidents that painted the highway red, domestic violence scenes that haunted my dreams, drug dealers who would kill without hesitation. But none of that compared to the bone-deep wrongness of reading my own handwriting, while listening to my own voice give me orders from somewhere, or somewhen, else. The new radio crackled to life, and my voice, but not my voice, began providing updated instructions. Return to the parking lot. Drive to coordinates that would take me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Provo. Wait for further instructions. Do not deviate from the route. Do not contact backup. Do not question the orders. As I walked back to my cruiser, the other vehicles in the parking lot remained perfectly still, but I could feel eyes watching me from behind their tinted windows. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming, as if every shadow, every reflection, every surface capable of holding an image contained someone, or something, studying my every move. The drive to Provo became a nightmare of mounting paranoia and increasing disorientation. The radio continued its instructions, but now multiple versions of my voice began overlapping, creating a chorus of commands that sometimes contradicted each other. Turn left. Continue straight. Stop at the next mile marker. Maintain current speed. The voices grew more numerous with each mile, until the radio buzzed with what sounded like dozens of different versions of myself, all speaking at once. The warehouse, when I finally reached it, was exactly as the radio had described. abandoned, isolated, surrounded by empty lots and dying vegetation. But there were other police cruisers in the parking area, vehicles from different departments, different states, even different eras. Some looked decades old, their paint schemes and equipment clearly from earlier generations of law enforcement. Others seemed futuristic, their designs unlike anything currently in service. And beside each vehicle stood a figure in a police uniform, each one perfectly motionless, each one facing the warehouse entrance. As I parked and stepped out of my cruiser, I realized with growing horror that all the figures looked exactly like me. Different ages, different uniforms, but unmistakably the same face, the same build, the same way of standing with the weight slightly shifted to the left foot. Some appeared younger than I remembered being, others older than I could imagine becoming. But all were me, and all were waiting. The radio in my hand crackled with instruction, but now the voice was different. Older, wearier, carrying the weight of experiences I hadn't lived yet. This version of myself explained that the warehouse contained the source of the transmissions, the point where all possibilities converged. Every choice I'd ever made or could make led to this moment, to this decision. I could enter the warehouse and join the other versions of myself, becoming part of the frequency that sent warnings back through time. Or I could choose differently, return to my normal life, and eventually become the version of myself that would stand in this same parking lot, waiting for the next iteration to arrive. The choice, he told me, was mine. But he also warned that choosing to leave would only delay the inevitable. Time was a circle here, and every possible version of my future led back to this moment, to this decision, to this warehouse full of possibilities I didn't want to understand. As I stood in the dying light of the Utah desert, surrounded by versions of myself that shouldn't exist, listening to my own voice offer explanations that made no sense, I realized that I'd lost the ability to distinguish between reality and nightmare. The radio continued its transmission, the other figures remained motionless, and the warehouse waited with its doors open like a mouth ready to swallow another possibility. I still don't know if I entered that building or drove away. I remember making the choice, but not which choice I made. I remember the sensation of walking forward and the sensation of returning to my cruiser with equal clarity. Both memories feel completely real. Both feel like lies. What I do know is that I returned to my apartment that night, hung my jacket in the closet where it belonged, and tried to convince myself that everything had been a hallucination brought on by heat and stress. But sometimes, late at night, my radio picks up transmissions on frequencies that shouldn't exist, and I hear my own voice giving instructions to someone who sounds exactly like me. The frequency is still active, still sending its warnings across probability. And sometimes, when I'm patrolling Interstate 15 in the early morning hours, I see a sedan driving exactly at the speed limit, maintaining perfect lane discipline, and feeling completely wrong. But now I know better than to pull it over. Now I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some frequencies better left untuned, and some versions of ourselves better left unmet. The radio continues its transmissions, and somewhere in the spaces between seconds, all the choices I didn't make are still making themselves. I just hope that the version of me that sends the warnings made better decisions than the one who receives them. Story 9. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled up to Marcus's hunting cabin, dust swirling in the late afternoon heat like ghosts reluctant to settle. 3 years. 3 years since we'd spoken, since that argument that carved a canyon between us deeper than any geological formation these Wallowa mountains could claim. The cabin squatted against the tree line, weathered cedar shingles dark with age and neglect, windows staring out like hollow eyes that had seen too much. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. Even the birds seemed hesitant here, their calls distant and muffled. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read 87 degrees, the kind of sweltering July heat that made your shirt stick to your back and turned the air thick as syrup. Yet something cold crawled up my spine as I studied the cabin's facade. A piece of paper, stark white against the weathered door, fluttered in the breeze. My boots, City shoes, really, entirely inappropriate for mountain terrain, echoed on the wooden porch steps. The note was pinned with a rusty thumbtack, the paper damp despite the lack of recent rain. The handwriting was unmistakably Marcus's, that careful script he'd maintained since childhood, despite our father's mocking. Follow the footprints in the snow before they follow you. I read it twice, 3 times, the words refusing to make sense. Snow? The nearest patches wouldn't appear until October, and even then only on the highest peaks. The thermometer nailed beside the door confirmed what my sweat-soaked shirt already knew. This was deep summer, the kind of heat that made lizards seek shade. The spare key sat in its usual hiding spot beneath the ceramic frog our mother had given Marcus for his housewarming. Inside, the cabin held that peculiar staleness of a place sealed too long, mixed with something else, something that made my nostrils flare involuntarily. Pine sol, maybe, or bleach. The kind of sharp chemical smell that suggested someone had been cleaning. Recently. I dropped my duffel bag beside the door and surveyed the main room. Everything appeared exactly as I remembered. The moth-eaten couch facing the stone fireplace, the oak dining table scarred by years of poker games and beer bottles, the mounted deer head whose glass eyes seemed to track my movement. But something felt wrong, like a song played in a slightly different key. That's when I noticed the water. Dark patches on the hardwood floor, roughly boot-shaped, created a trail from the back door to where I stood. The marks were still damp, edges well-defined as if someone had just walked through, leaving puddles that caught the light filtering through dusty windows. But the back door was locked, had been locked when I'd circled the cabin checking for signs of forced entry. I knelt beside the nearest print, my hand hovering inches above the wet wood. The moisture felt cold, impossibly cold for a day when the heat was making the cabin's metal roof tick and pop with expansion. A size 12 boot, maybe 13, with a distinctive tread pattern that looked military issue. Marcus wore size 11, same as me. Always had. The trail led toward the kitchen, each print evenly spaced, purposeful. I followed them, my heart performing an irregular rhythm against my ribs. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical song, but underneath that familiar sound was something else, a rhythmic dripping, like water from a leaky faucet. But all the faucets were dry. I traced the sound to the kitchen's back corner, where another note had been tucked behind the ancient coffee maker. Same handwriting, same damp paper. They're getting closer. Check under the cabin. My hands trembled as I folded the note. The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned an engineering degree and balanced spreadsheets for a living, insisted on logical explanations. Marcus was playing some elaborate prank, payback for the harsh words we'd exchanged 3 years ago. Or maybe he was having some kind of breakdown, leaving nonsensical notes for his own amusement. But rationality couldn't explain the wet footprints still gleaming on the floor, or the way the air seemed to thicken with each breath I took. The afternoon light was failing faster than it should have, shadows stretching long fingers across the cabin floor. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer, its beam weak but functional. The basement access was outside, around the cabin's east side, hidden beneath a metal storm door I'd forgotten existed. The hinges protested with a rusty shriek as I pulled the door open. A ladder disappeared into darkness that seemed absolute. Hungry. The smell hit me immediately. That same chemical sharpness from inside the cabin, but stronger now, mixed with something organic and unpleasant. My feet had barely touched the basement floor when the flashlight beam caught them. 3 pairs of hiking boots, arranged in a neat row against the foundation wall. Each pair was filled to the brim with what looked like white stones, smooth and uniform. But as I moved closer, the beam revealed the truth. Dry ice. The stones smoked faintly in the warmer air, creating tiny wisps of vapor that danced in the flashlight's glow. I reached for the nearest boot, then jerked my hand back as the cold bit through my skin. These weren't just filled with dry ice. They were packed solid. The frozen carbon dioxide formed into perfect boot-shaped molds. The tread patterns matched the wet prints upstairs exactly. Behind me, something creaked. I spun around, flashlight beams sweeping the basement's corners. but found only shadows and dust-covered storage boxes. My breathing sounded harsh in the confined space, almost panicked. When I turned back to the boots, a fourth pair had appeared beside the others. That was impossible. I'd been looking at that wall for less than 10 seconds, and the basement had only one entrance. But there they were, as real as the cold that was now seeping through my shirt, despite the heat upstairs. A new note protruded from the fourth pair, the paper frost-covered and crackling. The lake. Before they complete the circle. I knew the lake he meant. Glacial Lake, the small body of water about 2 miles up the mountain trail, where Marcus had spent countless hours during our childhood, casting lines for rainbow trout and spinning stories about the monsters that supposedly lived in its depths. Our grandfather had told us those stories, tales of things that slept beneath the ice and only surfaced when the water was disturbed by careless fishermen. Childhood nonsense. But standing in that basement, surrounded by impossible boots filled with impossible ice, nonsense felt like the most rational explanation available. I grabbed the nearest pair, ignoring the way the cold burned through my palms, and climbed back toward daylight. The sun was setting now, painting the cabin walls orange and red, but the warmth couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep in my bones. Back inside, the wet footprints had multiplied. They no longer formed a simple trail from back door to front. Now they created a complex pattern across the main room, overlapping and intersecting like a dance floor after a particularly enthusiastic wedding. Some prints were fresh, water still beating on their edges, while others had dried to faint shadows on the wood. But what made my stomach lurch was their arrangement. They were forming a rough circle around the cabin's perimeter, following the walls with military precision. The circle was maybe 80% complete, with only a narrow gap near the front door, the exact spot where I stood. The boots in my hands grew heavier, the cold spreading up my arms like frostbite in reverse. Dry ice had a sublimation point of -78 degrees Celsius. At room temperature, it should have dissipated within hours. Yet these boots showed no signs of melting, the ice as solid as when I'd first discovered them. Outside, something moved past the kitchen window. I caught just a glimpse, a shape too tall to be natural, walking with the same measured pace as the footprints suggested. By the time I reached the window, whatever it was had vanished into the tree line, leaving only the swaying branches as evidence of its passage. My reflection stared back from the glass, eyes wide and face pale in the gathering dusk. But behind my reflection, something else moved, another figure, this one standing in the cabin's main room. I spun around, heart hammering, but found only empty space and those damned wet footprints. When I looked back at the window, both reflections were gone. The hike to Glacial Lake had never seemed so long. Even in full daylight, the trail challenged casual hikers with its steep grades and loose rock. In the failing light, carrying 2 pairs of boots that radiated cold like miniature Arctic systems, it became an exercise in controlled panic. Every shadow might have hidden a figure. Every rustle in the underbrush could have been footsteps matching my pace. The forest, which had always felt like sanctuary during our childhood explorations, now seemed hostile and watchful. Birds called to each other in harsh voices that sounded almost like warnings. The boots grew heavier with each step, the cold now spreading through my torso like an infection. Several times I considered abandoning them beside the trail, but something, instinct, desperation, or simple terror, kept me moving forward. The notes had been clear. The lake. Before they complete the circle. What would happen when the circle closed? My imagination provided several possibilities, none of them comforting. Glacial Lake revealed itself gradually, first as a glimmer through the trees, then as a full expanse of dark water reflecting the first stars. The surface was perfectly still, like black glass that had never known wind or disturbance. Our grandfather's stories whispered at the edges of my memory, things that slept beneath the ice, waiting for the right moment to surface. But there was no ice now. Just that unnatural stillness and the growing sensation that I was being observed from multiple directions. I set the boots at the water's edge, my hands cramping as feeling returned to my fingers. The dry ice continued its slow sublimation, creating tendrils of vapor that danced across the water's surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lake began to respond. Ripples formed where there should have been none, concentric circles spreading outward from some disturbance beneath the surface. The water near the boots grew cloudy, as if something was rising from the depths to investigate. The temperature around the lake dropped noticeably, my breath misting despite the summer heat. That's when I saw them. Other boots, dozens of them, arranged along the lake's shoreline like a military formation. Some were partially submerged, others sat on rocks or fallen logs, all filled with that same impossible ice. They stretched around the entire perimeter of the lake, a circle within a circle, and in the center of the lake something dark and large was moving just beneath the surface. I backed away from the water's edge, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet felt heavy, unresponsive, as if the cold from the boots had somehow infected the ground itself. When I looked down, new wet footprints were appearing around my shoes, forming their own circle with me at the center. The realization hit like ice water in my veins. I wasn't returning the boots. I was completing the collection. Behind me, the forest had gone completely silent. No night birds, no insect chorus, no whisper of wind through pine needles. Just the soft lapping of water against the shore and the steady rhythm of my own panicked breathing. A voice drifted across the lake, familiar, yet wrong, like Marcus speaking through water. "Welcome home, brother." I turned toward the sound and saw a figure standing on the far shore, tall and motionless among the trees. Even at this distance, even in the growing darkness, I could see it wasn't quite right. Too thin, too tall, moving with a fluid grace that human joints couldn't achieve. More figures emerged from the forest, forming their own circle around the lake. They stood perfectly still, patient as monuments, waiting for something I couldn't understand. The dry ice in the boots at my feet had begun to glow, a soft blue phosphorescence that spread across the water's surface. The lake itself was changing, its black depths taking on that same ethereal light, and I could see shapes moving beneath the surface. Shapes that might once have been human, but had been transformed by cold and time, and something far older than either. My grandfather's stories weren't stories at all. I stumbled backward, terror finally overcoming the strange lethargy that had gripped my limbs. The wet footprints followed me, appearing faster now, dozens of them forming complex patterns that seemed to guide my retreat. But every direction I turned led to more prints, more figures emerging from the darkness, more evidence that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The circle was closing. I ran then, abandoning any pretense of courage or rational thought. The trail back to the cabin blurred past in a nightmare of grasping branches and treacherous footing. Behind me, the lake continued its eerie glow, and the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, all walking in perfect synchronization, echoed through the forest. The cabin appeared ahead, windows blazing with impossible light for a structure without electricity. I burst through the front door and slammed it behind me, my hands shaking as I turned the deadbolt. But inside, the wet footprints had completed their circle. They formed a perfect ring around the cabin's interior, each print gleaming with fresh moisture despite my absence. And standing in the center of that circle, translucent and flickering like heat shimmer, was Marcus. He smiled, that same gentle expression he'd worn as a child when trying to convince me that his latest wild story was absolutely true. "You found them," he said, though his lips didn't move. "I knew you would." "Marcus," the word came out as barely a whisper. "What happened to you?" "The same thing that's happening to you." His form solidified slightly, becoming more real with each passing second. "The lake calls, and we answer. We've been waiting for you to complete the circle." The temperature in the cabin dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Frost began forming on the windows, and my breath came in visible puffs. The wet footprints around the circle started to glow with that same blue phosphorescence I'd seen at the lake. "This isn't real," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "You're dead. You've been missing for 3 years." "Missing?" Marcus tilted his head, his expression genuinely puzzled. "I've been right here, waiting. We all have. He gestured toward the windows, and I saw them, the figures from the lake, standing motionless around the cabin's exterior. They formed another circle, larger than the one inside, and their eyes reflected that same blue light. The boots, Marcus continued, they anchor us, give us form in this world. But they need to be returned to the lake regularly, or we fade. You helped with that. The implications crashed over me like an avalanche. How long have you been doing this? How many people have you helped? Marcus's smile never wavered. Only the ones who belonged here. Only family. The cabin around us began to change, walls becoming translucent, revealing the forest beyond. The furniture faded to shadows, and the floor beneath my feet felt less solid with each passing moment. Reality itself seemed to be losing its grip, replaced by something older and hungrier. You can fight it, Marcus said, his voice growing distant. But the cold will find you eventually. It's already in your bones. He was right. The chill that had started when I first touched the boots had spread throughout my body, and I could feel my thoughts becoming sluggish, distant. The urge to simply lie down and let the cold take me was almost overwhelming. But something deep inside, the same stubborn streak that had carried me through engineering school and 15 years of corporate politics, refused to surrender. I forced my legs to move, stumbling toward the back door. "Where will you go?" Marcus called after me. "The circle is complete now. There's nowhere left to run." I burst out of the cabin and into the night, the cold hitting me like a physical blow. The figures around the cabin turned as one to watch my flight, but they didn't pursue. They didn't need to, because Marcus was right. The wet footprints were everywhere now, covering every inch of ground in a complex mandala that stretched into the forest as far as I could see. And each step I took added to the pattern, my own prints joining the design whether I wanted them to or not. I'm writing this by flashlight, huddled in my car at the base of the mountain. The engine won't start. Hasn't started since I tried to leave 20 minutes ago. The footprints have reached the asphalt now, forming neat rows beside my tires. In the distance, I can see the cabin glowing with that blue phosphorescence, and figures moving in its windows. They're patient. They know I'll return eventually. The cold is spreading. My fingers can barely hold the pen, and frost is forming on the windshield despite the summer heat. Soon I'll have to choose. Freeze to death in this car, or walk back up the mountain and accept whatever Marcus and the others have become. But there's a third option, the one I'm hoping someone will find if they ever discover this account. The lake. If the boots anchor them to this world, then maybe destroying the lake itself would break the cycle. A small charge, properly placed, could trigger a landslide that would bury the water under tons of rock and earth. Of course, that would mean going back. Back to the cabin, back to the trail, back to Glacial Lake, where the things that were once human wait in their perfect circles. The footprints are at my door now. I can hear them forming, one after another, patient as falling snow. Follow the footprints in the snow before they follow you, but there never was any snow. There was only the cold, and the lake, and the things that sleep beneath the ice. And now they're waking up. Story 10. The coordinates came through an encrypted message on a platform I'd never heard of. WhisperNet, some deep web forum for amateur investigators. No username, no profile, just numbers and a single line. They're still talking in Shenandoah. Listen, I should have deleted it immediately. Should have chalked it up to another conspiracy theorist trying to waste my time. But 3 people had vanished in Shenandoah National Park over the past 18 months. And the official investigation had gone cold faster than morning frost on Virginia granite. My podcast, Missing Frequencies, thrived on the cases nobody wanted to touch. The drive from Richmond took 4 hours through winding mountain roads that seemed to curl tighter with each mile. October had painted the Appalachians in rust and gold, but the colors felt muted under the overcast sky, as if someone had turned down the saturation on the world. My phone lost signal 20 miles before the coordinates, leaving me with nothing but the GPS unit and a growing knot in my stomach. The location wasn't on any trail. I had to park at a ranger station and hike 3 miles through unmarked forest, following the coordinates on my handheld GPS like breadcrumbs through increasingly dense woodland. The trees grew taller here, their canopy so thick that afternoon felt like twilight. My footsteps seemed to echo wrong, too sharp, too crisp, like the forest was amplifying every sound I made while muffling everything else. I found them in a clearing that shouldn't have existed. 7 monoliths of dark slate stood in a perfect circle, each about 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide. They weren't natural formations. The edges were too clean, too deliberate, but they weren't recent either. Moss crept up their sides in patterns that spoke of decades, maybe centuries of weathering. The grass within the circle grew differently, shorter and darker, as if the soil itself remembered something the rest of the forest had forgotten. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant highway hum. Just the faintest vibration in the air, barely perceptible, like standing too close to power lines. I pulled out my audio recorder, a professional-grade Zoom H6 that had captured everything from whispered confessions to thunderstorms, and hit record. The needle jumped. Not gradually, like it should with ambient sound. It spiked immediately to levels that should have meant I was standing next to a freight train. But I heard nothing. I checked the input levels, adjusted the gain, even smacked the side of the device. The meters kept dancing, registering sound that didn't exist, or sound I couldn't hear yet. I stepped closer to the nearest monolith. The stone felt warm under my palm, despite the October chill. The vibration was stronger here, traveling up my arm like a low-frequency massage. I held the recorder against the slate surface. The display went wild. Audio levels spiked and fell in patterns that looked almost like speech. Peaks and valleys, pauses and emphasis, like the stone was trying to tell me something in a language made of frequencies my ears couldn't decode. I played back the recording through my headphones. Static filled my ears, but underneath it, something else. A rhythm. A cadence. And then, clear as if someone were standing beside me, my own voice asking, "How many of them came before you?" I yanked off the headphones, heart hammering. I hadn't spoken those words, hadn't even thought them. But the voice was unmistakably mine. Same inflection, same slight rasp from too many years of late-night recording sessions. The recorder was still running. I lifted it again, hands trembling now, and spoke into the microphone. "This is Marcus Chen, October 15th, investigating disappearances in Shenandoah National Park. I'm at coordinates." I stopped. During playback, my voice would be asking that question I'd never asked. I knew it with the same certainty I knew my own name. The silence stretched until it felt like pressure against my eardrums. The monoliths stood unmoved, but something about their arrangement seemed different now. Had they been quite so tall before? Quite so close together? I tried to step backward, out of the circle. My feet wouldn't move. Not frozen, nothing supernatural or dramatic, just reluctant. Like walking away from the recorder felt wrong somehow. Unprofessional. I had a story here, the kind of story that could make careers or destroy them. The kind that required complete documentation. I hit record again. This time I heard the vibration as sound. Low, thrumming, like a massive tuning fork struck somewhere deep underground. The monoliths seemed to hum in harmony, each stone contributing a different pitch to a chord that resonated in my chest cavity. Through my headphones, my own voice was already responding to questions I hadn't asked yet. The first one came in September. Sarah Mitchell, hiking alone. She heard the calling and followed it here. My mouth moved, but I wasn't controlling the words. They emerged with my accent, my speech patterns, but the thoughts weren't mine. I was a passenger in my own body, listening to myself describe things I'd never learned. The second was James Hoffman, October 3rd. He brought a camera. The images didn't develop right. Too much light or not enough. Depends on how you look at them. I tried to lower the recorder, but my arm stayed rigid. Professional instincts warred with growing panic. This was either the find of the century or a complete psychotic break, and I couldn't tell which terrified me more. The third was Rebecca Santos. She understood faster than the others. Sat in the center and let us explain. She's still here, in a way, in the frequencies. The humming grew louder, more complex. Harmonics layered upon harmonics until the sound became texture, became pressure, became something that bypassed my ears entirely and spoke directly to my nervous system. The recorder's display showed levels that should have been damaging, but instead of pain, I felt clarity. I could see the pattern now. The disappearances weren't random, they were selections. The anonymous message hadn't been a tip, it had been an invitation, a recruitment. You're the fourth, Marcus, but you have something the others didn't. You have the equipment, the expertise, the voice they've been waiting for. I don't understand, I said aloud, and immediately heard my recorded response. Understanding isn't required, only listening, only letting the archive complete itself. The monoliths weren't markers. They were recording devices, ancient ones, carved from stone that held sound the way amber held insects. Every word spoken in this circle, every thought, every moment of consciousness, all of it preserved in frequencies locked within the slate. But preservation required participation. The stones needed fresh voices to interpret the old ones, new minds to process the accumulated data. The missing hikers hadn't disappeared. They'd been integrated. Their voices, their knowledge, their memories all added to the growing collection. My recorder beeped. Low battery. In normal circumstances, I'd have spare batteries, backup devices, but nothing about this felt normal anymore. The forest beyond the circle seemed increasingly distant, increasingly irrelevant. The world outside these 7 stones was just interference, static disrupting the signal. I could leave. Some part of me knew that. I could drop the recorder, step backward, return to my car and drive home and file this under unexplained phenomena for a future episode. But the recording was incomplete, the story unfinished, and I was a professional. The battery died just as my recorded voice began explaining the real purpose of the circle, the true nature of what I'd found. The silence returned, but it felt different now, expectant, patient. I had backup equipment in my car, fresh batteries, higher capacity storage. I could return with everything needed to capture the complete archive, to preserve not just my voice but all the voices held within the stones. The thought of leaving the circle felt like abandoning a scoop. Worse, it felt like breaking faith with the story itself. I sat down in the center of the clearing, cross-legged on the dark grass. The humming resumed, softer now, welcoming. Around me, the monoliths stood like patient sentinels, waiting for me to understand what they'd been trying to tell every visitor who'd ever found this place. The batteries in my backup recorder would last 6 hours, more than enough time to capture everything, to become part of something larger than any single story, any individual voice. The last thing I remember thinking, before the frequencies took over completely, was that this would make an incredible episode, probably my best work. When the park rangers found my car 3 days later, the only clue was my notebook, left open on the passenger seat. The last entry was a set of coordinates, written in handwriting that looked like mine but somehow wasn't quite right. The letters too precise, too uniform, as if traced rather than written. They never found my body, never found the recording equipment. But sometimes, late at night when the radio waves propagate just right, other podcasters pick up fragments of transmission from somewhere in the Shenandoah wilderness. Always the same voice, always the same message. The archive is incomplete. We're still accepting applications. The transmissions never last long enough to trace, but they're getting clearer, stronger, and they're always recruiting. Story 11. The Nevada sun had been pressing down on Route 95 for 12 straight hours when I first saw the gas station. Heat mirages warped the asphalt ahead, making the building shimmer like something from a fever dream. My documentary project on vintage roadside signage had led me through dozens of forgotten towns. But this place felt different. Wrong. The station squatted against the desert like a wounded animal. its faded Texaco star barely visible through decades of sandblasted paint. But it was the sign that made me pull over, a towering neon monument from the 1950s, dark letters spelling Desert Rose Motel in cursive script that would have blazed electric blue against the night sky. Would have if any of the tubes still worked. I parked my dusty Jeep beside the single pump and stepped into air thick enough to chew. The silence hit me first, that absolute desert quiet that makes your ears ring with phantom sounds. Then I noticed them. 3 figures sat in mismatched beach chairs arranged in a perfect semicircle, facing the dead sign like spectators at a drive-in theater. They didn't acknowledge my arrival, didn't even seem to breathe. The nearest was a woman in her 60s, paper-thin skin stretched over sharp bones, wearing a floral dress that might have been fashionable during the Carter administration. Next to her, a man roughly the same age clutched a can of beer that hadn't been manufactured since the 80s, the aluminum oxidized to a dull gray. The third figure was younger, maybe 40, but something about his posture suggested he'd been sitting there much longer than seemed possible. The woman spoke without turning her head, her voice carrying that peculiar flatness of someone talking to themselves. She said they'd been waiting for someone like me, someone with the right equipment. The man with the beer added that photographers used to come through regularly, back when the sign still had its moments. The younger one just smiled and gestured toward the towering monument with movements that seemed slightly out of sync with the rest of his body. I approached slowly, my camera bag feeling heavier with each step. The woman explained that the sign had a particular sequence, a pattern where all the letters would flash simultaneously for exactly 3 seconds. It hadn't happened since 1984, she claimed, but they knew it would happen again. They always knew. The man with the beer stood up with joints that creaked audibly in the desert air. He told me about the other photographers who had tried and failed, their equipment mysteriously malfunctioning just when the moment came. Some had given up after a few attempts. Others had kept trying until their cameras stopped working entirely, lenses clouded with sand that shouldn't have been able to penetrate sealed housings. I set up my tripod as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the defunct sign with grasping fingers. The digital display on my camera showed full battery life, but something about the way the LCD flickered made me check the backup batteries in my bag. All charged, all secure. The first flash came just as twilight settled over the desert. My finger was already on the shutter when the neon blazed to life, but only for half the letters. DZ Rosemo, the gaps yawning like missing teeth in a skull's grin. I captured the image, but the woman in the floral dress shook her head slowly. Not right, she said. Not the sequence they'd been waiting for. As soon as the partial letters died, I felt it, a subtle shift in the air pressure, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. My camera's battery indicator dropped from full to 3/4 in the space of a heartbeat. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread the display, but the numbers didn't lie. The second attempt came 20 minutes later. This time, more letters participated in the cruel dance. D. Ert, O's Mtel. Still incomplete, still wrong. The woman's disappointment was palpable, radiating from her like heat waves. The man with the beer crushed the can slowly, the aluminum collapsing with the sound of grinding bones, and immediately produced another from somewhere I couldn't see. My battery indicator now showed half power. I'd taken perhaps a dozen shots since arriving, nowhere near enough to drain a fresh battery. More disturbing was the thin layer of sand I discovered coating my lens when I went to clean it. I'd been careful, keeping the camera covered between shots, but the sand was there nonetheless, fine, almost powdery, clinging to the glass with unusual persistence. The third flash sequence arrived without warning. Desert Arsa Motel, closer to completion but still frustratingly incomplete. I fired the shutter reflexively, already knowing it wasn't right. The woman's sigh carried across the parking lot like wind through a graveyard. The younger man's smile grew wider, though his eyes remained fixed on the sign. By now, the battery display showed a critical 20%. The sand in my camera bag had multiplied, tiny grains working their way into crevices and seams despite my efforts to keep everything sealed. Worse, the sand felt wrong against my fingertips. Too fine, too uniform, as if each grain had been individually crafted for the sole purpose of destroying electronic equipment. I found myself checking my watch compulsively, but the digital display seemed to flicker between different times. Sometimes it showed 8:47 p.m., sometimes 11:23, occasionally displaying impossible combinations like 2591. The rational part of my mind insisted on equipment failure, but rationality felt thin out here, stretched gossamer fine between the vast sky and the patient desert. The fourth flash came with the sound of electricity arcing through dead air. Desert Rose Motel, complete for perhaps half a second before two letters failed, leaving Desert RC Motel glowing against the star-drunk sky. So close. I could feel the woman's tension like a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders. My camera was dying. The battery icon blinked angry red warnings, and the LCD screen had developed a peculiar shimmer, as if viewed through heat waves. The sand was everywhere now, in my bag, coating my lenses, somehow worked into the very mechanism of my tripod. Every surface felt gritty, contaminated. The man with the beer stood up again, his movements accompanied by that same unsettling creak. He suggested I might want to check my other equipment, make sure everything was ready for the next attempt. His voice carried an odd echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. I discovered that my backup batteries had somehow drained themselves to nothing while sitting unused in my bag. The LED flashlight I'd brought was dead. Even my car's headlights, when I tested them, produced only a weak amber glow before flickering out entirely. The Jeep's engine turned over reluctantly, coughing like an old man with pneumonia. The woman in the floral dress finally turned to look at me directly, and I saw that her eyes reflected the non-existent neon light with an eerie phosphorescence. She explained that the sign was hungry, that it had been feeding on photographers' equipment for decades, sustaining itself on the electrical life force of cameras and batteries and hope. One more try, she suggested. Just one more. The fifth flash sequence felt different from the moment it began. The air hummed with potential energy, and even the desert seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Desert Rose Motel blazed complete and perfect against the night sky, every letter burning with the intensity of a small sun. I pressed the shutter with fingers that felt disconnected from my hand. The flash fired once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, far more than the single burst I'd intended. Light strobed across the parking lot, casting everything in stark black and white like old police photographs. In the strobing illumination, I caught glimpses of things that shouldn't have been there. Dozens of photographers scattered around the lot, all holding cameras, all staring at the sign with expressions of desperate hunger. When the strobing stopped, they were gone. Only the 3 original spectators remained, but they were standing now, applauding slowly with dry sounds like autumn leaves. The woman in the floral dress spoke about perfect timing, about finally capturing the sequence after so many years of waiting. But my camera was dead, completely drained, the LCD screen as black as the desert beyond the reach of the dying sign. I tried to check the images I'd captured, but the device was as lifeless as a stone. The backup equipment in my bag had suffered the same fate. Batteries corroded to white powder, circuits fused with sand that seemed to have appeared from thin air. The man with the beer approached, offering me a drink from his eternally self-replenishing supply. The aluminum was ice-cold despite the desert heat, condensation beating on the surface in patterns that looked almost like writing. He suggested I might want to stay the night, wait for morning to assess the damage to my equipment. The motel had been closed since 1984, but rooms were still available for the right kind of guest. The younger man pointed toward a building I hadn't noticed before, a low-slung structure with doors that gaped open like wounds. Vacancy signs flickered with the same impossible neon as the main sign, advertising rates from decades past. The woman mentioned that time moved differently here, that photographers sometimes stayed for what felt like hours, only to discover that years had passed in the outside world. I backed toward my Jeep on legs that felt like water, but the engine that had coughed to life moments before now refused to turn over at all. The headlights remained dark. Even the digital clock on the dashboard showed nothing but empty black space where numbers should have been. The three spectators resumed their positions in the beach chairs, faces turned expectantly toward the sign that now pulsed with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The woman in the floral dress mentioned that the next photographer would arrive soon. They always did, drawn by some inexplicable magnetism to this forgotten stretch of desert highway. The equipment failure was just part of the process, she explained. The sign needed to feed before it could perform its complete sequence. I found myself walking toward the motel despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The younger man held open a door that shouldn't have existed, revealing a room frozen in time with a bed still turned down for guests who had checked out 40 years ago. The sheets smelled of desert wind and electrical storms. As I write this account, using a pencil I found in the nightstand drawer, the only writing implement that still functions, I can see more photographers arriving. Their headlights pierce the darkness briefly before failing, their cameras clicking futilely at a sign that glows just bright enough to promise perfect shots that never quite materialize. The woman in the floral dress has taken up residence outside my window, arranging her beach chair for optimal viewing. She's mentioned that morning won't come until the sequence completes properly, until someone captures the full 3-second illumination exactly as it's meant to be seen. The man with the beer has produced a cooler from somewhere, keeping his supply fresh for the long wait ahead. I can hear my Jeep starting up outside, but when I look through the dusty curtains, I see another photographer unpacking equipment from a vehicle identical to mine. He's checking his batteries, testing his flash, positioning his tripod with the confidence of someone who hasn't yet learned what this place demands. The sign pulses brighter, feeding on his hope and preparation. Soon it will flash its incomplete sequence, and his equipment will begin its slow death from sand and electromagnetic hunger. He'll try again and again, each attempt drawing him deeper into the sign's influence, until he too takes up residence in this temporal pocket where 1984 bleeds into every subsequent year. The woman outside my window has started her countdown, the same ritual she's performed for every photographer who's made the attempt. In the distance, I can see others, decades worth of failed documentarians, all sitting in their own beach chairs, all waiting for the perfect shot that will either set them free or bind them here forever. My pencil is growing shorter with each word, worn down by the friction of recording what might be the last coherent thoughts I have before joining the eternal audience. The sign's pulse is synchronized with my heartbeat now, and I can feel sand collecting in my lungs with each breath. Tomorrow, if tomorrow comes, another photographer will arrive, drawn by the same mysterious compulsion that brought me here. They'll see 3 figures in beach chairs, or perhaps 4, watching a sign that promises everything and delivers only beautiful, perfect failure. The sequence is beginning again. D's. Rose Mo. Not right, never right, but almost, always almost. Story 12. The first mark appeared on an ancient white pine, carved deep enough to weep amber tears down its scarred bark. I almost missed it. Just another piece of trail vandalism, I thought, until I noticed the precision. 3 clean lines forming a perfect triangle, each edge measured with mathematical certainty. The point aimed directly toward where I'd pitched my tent in the clearing below. I'd come to the Adirondacks seeking solitude, craving the kind of silence that only existed miles from cell towers and highway noise. The trail map showed this area as unmarked wilderness, a gray void between established paths where serious hikers could disappear for days without seeing another soul. Perfect for a man trying to forget the sound of divorce papers being shuffled across a mahogany desk, the way my ex-wife's lawyer had smiled when she mentioned my extended camping trips as evidence of abandonment. The second triangle materialized on an oak tree 20 yards northeast of my camp, carved with the same meticulous care. This one felt older somehow, the cuts weathered but still sharp, as if whoever had made them possessed tools that bit cleaner than time itself. I ran my fingers along the grooves, feeling the rough edges where bark had tried unsuccessfully to heal over the wounds. The wood beneath was darker than it should have been, stained with something that wasn't quite sap. My rational mind cataloged possible explanations: survey marks, boundary indicators, geocaching coordinates. But standing there in the late afternoon shadows, watching how the carved lines seemed to drink in the failing light, rationality felt increasingly insufficient. The triangle pointed toward my tent with the same unwavering certainty as the first. The third mark waited on a massive elm that must have predated European settlement. Its triangle completed a perfect geometric pattern, with my campsite sitting at the exact center. I discovered it just as dusk began to bleed purple through the canopy, and the realization hit me like cold water. I was surrounded. 3 points of an equilateral triangle, each carved with impossible precision, each aiming inward like accusatory fingers. I told myself it was coincidence. Surely dozens of campers had used this clearing over the years. The positioning was random, meaningless, but as I traced the sight lines from tree to tree, the angles remained obstinately perfect. Someone, or something, had measured this space with the patience of centuries. Night fell with unusual weight, as if the darkness carried substance. I built my fire higher than necessary, feeding it logs until the flames reached toward the low-hanging branches. The light pushed back the encroaching shadows but couldn't quite reach the marked trees. They remained at the edge of visibility, their triangular scars catching and reflecting the firelight in ways that made them appear to pulse like slow heartbeats. The whispers began at midnight. At first, I mistook them for wind through the leaves, that soft susurration that sounds almost like conversation if you listen long enough. But wind doesn't pause for punctuation, doesn't carry the careful cadence of formal speech. These voices emerged from the darkness beyond my fire's reach, speaking in measured tones that reminded me of courtroom proceedings. Res ipsa loquitur. The phrase drifted through the air like smoke, followed by longer passages I couldn't quite catch, Latin words strung together with legal precision, as if someone were dictating a judgment in the darkness. I strained to make out individual voices but heard only the collective murmur of distant deliberation. My camping experience included enough wildlife encounters to know the difference between animal sounds and human ones. This was definitively human, but wrong somehow, like hearing a familiar song played in a minor key. The speakers seemed to move around my campsite in a wide circle, their voices rising and fading as they passed through the triangle's vertices. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam toward the nearest marked tree. The light revealed nothing but empty forest. Yet the whispers continued, unperturbed by my desperate search. They spoke of boundaries and jurisdictions, of ancient rights and territorial claims. Words like terminus and meets floated through the darkness with bureaucratic authority. Sleep became impossible. I fed the fire obsessively, watching shadows dance across the tree line while Latin phrases wound around me like invisible chains. The voices grew more distinct as the night deepened, and I began to make out complete sentences. The respondent having entered unmarked territory, the court finds jurisdiction established by triangulation, the boundaries are recognized and binding. By 3 a.m., I understood with crystalline clarity that I was listening to a trial, my trial. The realization should have sent me running, but my legs refused to cooperate. Every time I stood to pack my gear, the whispers would intensify, and I'd find myself sitting back down as if pulled by invisible hands. The fire had become my courtroom dock, the darkness my judge and jury. I tried calling out, demanding to know who was there, what they wanted. The whispers paused for a moment, then resumed with what sounded like amused discussion. More Latin followed, punctuated by what I could swear was scholarly laughter. As dawn approached, the voices grew urgent. The legal terminology became more specific, more damning. I heard references to right-of-way and adverse possession, to ancient surveys and colonial land grants. They spoke of travelers who had entered this triangle without permission, who had been tried in absentia and found wanting. Then came the phrase that stopped my blood: proprietas transitus, property of passage. The whispers explained, in English now, as if wanting me to understand perfectly, that I had encamped within a jurisdiction circuit established by the Colonial Survey Court, a body that had never been officially dissolved. The triangular markers represented an ancient claim, a legal boundary that predated modern maps. Any traveler who sheltered within the circuit became subject to its authority. The court had deliberated through the night and reached its verdict. I was to be declared proprietas transitus, property of passage, bound to wander the marked territory until I could demonstrate legal right to traverse it. The sentence would take effect at sunrise unless I broke the circuit by destroying one of the markers. I lurched to my feet, grabbing my hatchet from beside the fire. The nearest triangle was on the white pine, 20 yards through underbrush that seemed to tangle around my boots like grasping fingers. Every step took tremendous effort, as if I were walking through deep water. The whispers followed me, rising to a crescendo of legal objections. They cited precedent, invoked ancient statutes, demanded I respect the proceedings. But beneath their formal language, I heard something else: desperation, as if my destruction of the marker would break more than just wood and bark. The white pine loomed before me, its triangular scar gleaming in the pre-dawn gloom. I raised the hatchet, feeling the weight of invisible eyes upon me. The whispers reached a fever pitch, Latin and English blending into a cacophony of legal protest. The blade bit deep into the carved lines, sending chips of bark and wood flying. The tree shuddered, or perhaps that was my imagination, and the whispers cut off abruptly, as if a radio had been switched off. Silence filled the forest like held breath. I hacked at the triangle until nothing remained but a raw wound in the bark. The other two markers still waited in the distance, but I could feel their pull weakening, the geometric perfection broken. My legs responded normally again, and I stumbled back to my campsite. By full dawn, I had packed my gear and navigated back to the main trail. The forest seemed ordinary again, filled with normal sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I convinced myself the whole experience had been exhaustion-induced hallucination, too many nights of poor sleep and too much stress. But 3 weeks later, sitting in a coffee shop in Albany, I opened a historical research database on my laptop. I searched for colonial surveying practices in the Adirondack region, expecting to find nothing. Instead, I found records of the Colonial Survey Court, a quasi-legal body established in 1723 to resolve boundary disputes in unsettled territories. The court had operated under special charter, with authority to claim jurisdiction over any unmarked land. Their surveying teams would establish jurisdiction circuits, triangular markers that created temporary courtrooms in the wilderness. The court had been dissolved in 1847 following complaints about overreach of authority. The final entry in the records mentioned several ongoing cases that would remain in deliberation indefinitely, pending resolution of territorial claims. I closed the laptop with shaking hands, trying to ignore the way the coffee shop's fluorescent lights created triangle-shaped shadows on the wall. Outside, a surveyor in an orange vest was setting up equipment across the street, measuring angles with meticulous precision. His smile, when he caught me watching, looked uncomfortably familiar. That night, in my apartment 50 miles from the nearest forest, I heard whispers through the walls, Latin phrases discussing property law and territorial jurisdiction. And I realized with growing horror that breaking one marker might not have been enough. The court, it seemed, had merely moved its deliberations to a new venue. Res ipsa loquitur indeed. Story 13. The GPS died somewhere between civilization and nowhere, leaving me with nothing but the hypnotic rhythm of windshield wipers against October rain. The Appalachian Mountains pressed in from both sides of the winding road, their ancient ridges disappearing into fog that seemed to swallow my headlights whole. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, my eyes burning from the strain of peering through the murk, when the cabin materialized from the mist, like something conjured from a fever dream. It shouldn't have been there. The road I'd taken wasn't on any map I could remember, yet here stood this weathered structure, its hand-carved sign barely visible through the downpour. Mountain Rest Lodge, vacancy. What struck me first wasn't the building itself, but the smell that somehow penetrated my sealed car windows. Fresh-cut pine, so sharp and green it made my sinuses ache. The scent carried an undertone of something older, earthier, like soil that had never seen sunlight. I pulled into the gravel lot, stones crunching under my tires with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the mountain silence. The cabin squatted before me, supported by what had to be dozens of tree trunks of varying sizes, their bark still weeping sap in long amber tears. Some posts were thick as telephone poles, others slender as fence posts, but all of them looked freshly hewn, their cut ends pale and raw against the darkening sky. The front door opened before I could knock, revealing a tall man whose age seemed to shift in the porch light's amber glow. His face was weathered like old leather, carved with lines that spoke of decades under mountain sun, yet his eyes held a brightness that belonged to someone much younger. He wore flannel that had seen better years and boots caked with sawdust. "Lost?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I nodded, suddenly aware of how the rain had soaked through my jacket during the brief walk from car to porch. My GPS gave out. I was heading to Asheville, but the mountains had other plans. He stepped aside, gesturing me in. "Name's Carl. Welcome to the Rest Lodge." The interior hit me with that pine scent again, concentrated now to an almost overwhelming degree. The walls were lined with more of those fresh-cut logs, their surfaces still showing the marks of whatever blade had shaped them. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing behind a grate that looked like it had been forged by hand. The furniture was sparse but solid, chairs and tables that appeared to have been carved from single pieces of wood, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hands. "You're lucky we have room," Carl said, moving behind a counter that served as the front desk. "Most folks who find us are too tired to be particular about accommodations." I signed the register with a pen that felt uncomfortably warm in my grip, noting that the previous entry was dated 3 weeks prior. The signature above mine belonged to someone named R. Holloway, though the handwriting looked shaky, almost frantic. "Now," Carl continued, his voice taking on a tone that reminded me of a tour guide beginning a well-rehearsed speech, "the Rest Lodge operates on a unique principle. Each guest chooses their own support beam, what we call a rest trunk. Your room will be directly above the trunk you select, and it's that particular piece of wood that'll be holding your ceiling up all night." He led me through a door at the back of the lobby into what could only be described as a grove. We were still indoors, yet dozens of tree trunks rose from the floor to disappear into the shadows above, each one bearing a small brass nameplate. The air here was thick with the smell of living wood and something else I couldn't quite identify, something organic and ancient. "The trees need dreams to stay strong," Carl explained, running his hand along the bark of a particularly large trunk. "When you sleep, your dreams feed into the wood. Keep it sturdy. But if you stay awake too long—" He gestured upward, and I followed his gaze to see that some of the trunks seemed to be bowing slightly, their tops disappearing into ceiling spaces that appeared to be sagging. "What happens if someone doesn't sleep?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. Carl's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, the trunk gets hungry, starts to weaken, and a weak trunk can't hold up a room forever." He showed me 3 available trunks, each one different in character and size. The first was massive, its circumference easily 6 feet around, its bark dark and deeply grooved. The nameplate read, "Endurance." The second was more modest, perhaps 3 feet across, with bark that seemed to shimmer in the overhead lighting. Its plate bore the word, "Serenity." The third was barely 2 feet wide, its surface smooth and pale, almost white. The nameplate simply said, "Truth." "Take your time choosing," Carl advised. "Once you pick, you're committed for the night. Can't change trunks mid-stay. That's problematic for the structure." Something in his tone made my skin crawl, but exhaustion was making my thoughts fuzzy. I found myself drawn to the smallest trunk, the one called Truth. Something about its pale bark called to me, though I couldn't say why. When I touched its surface, it felt warm, almost pulsing, like touching the throat of some enormous sleeping animal. "This one," I said. Carl nodded as if he'd expected as much. "Truth seekers usually pick that one. Fair warning, though, that particular trunk has some quirks. Doesn't like being ignored." Tends to get restless if its chosen guest stays awake too long. He handed me a key attached to a wooden fob carved to match my chosen trunk. The wood was warm against my palm, and I could swear I felt it pulse with the same rhythm I'd sensed in the tree itself. My room was directly above the truth trunk, accessible by a narrow staircase that seemed to wind around the tree's circumference. The walls followed the same pattern as downstairs, fresh-cut logs that wept sap like slow tears. A single bed occupied the center of the space, positioned directly over what I assumed was the trunk's crown. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet at its highest point, and I could see where the walls met the roof that the whole structure seemed to press downward with visible weight. A small window offered a view of the surrounding forest, though the rain and darkness made it impossible to see much beyond the glass. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and I realized I hadn't heard any other sounds since entering the building. No creaking floorboards from other guests, no voices from adjacent rooms. The silence was complete, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the roof and an occasional soft groan from somewhere deep in the building's bones. I settled onto the bed and tried to ignore the way the mattress seemed to pulse beneath me, matching that same rhythm I'd felt in the trunk downstairs. The sensation was subtle but persistent, like lying on the chest of a sleeping giant. Every few seconds, the entire room would shift almost imperceptibly, the walls exhaling with a sound like wind through dry leaves. That's when Carl's warning began to make sense. If I fell asleep, my dreams would feed the trunk, keep it strong enough to support the room. But what if I didn't want to feed this place? What if I wanted to leave in the morning with my dreams intact? I decided to stay awake. The first hour passed easily enough. I explored the room's meager contents, a dresser carved from the same pale wood as my trunk, a mirror that reflected my image with disturbing clarity, and a small bookshelf containing volumes on forest lore and mountain folklore. One book fell open in my hands to a passage about trees that consumed human essence, feeding on the electrical impulses of sleeping minds. The text described settlements where entire populations had vanished, leaving behind only empty houses and forests that grew with unnatural vigor. By the second hour, the room's pulsing had become more pronounced. The ceiling seemed to be settling lower, and I noticed hairline cracks forming where the walls met the roof. The trunk below was growing hungry, and my wakefulness was starving it. I tried reading to keep my mind occupied, but the words on the pages began to blur and shift. Sentences rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them, and paragraphs about mountain ecology became warnings about the price of defying natural order. The room's temperature seemed to fluctuate wildly, one moment uncomfortably warm, the next so cold my breath misted in the air. During the third hour, I began to hear sounds from within the walls. At first, it was just a soft scratching, like mice moving behind the logs. But gradually, the noise became more rhythmic, more purposeful. It sounded like something trying to claw its way out, or in. The scratching was accompanied by what might have been whispers, voices so faint I couldn't tell if they were real or products of my increasingly strained mind. The ceiling continued its inexorable descent. What had been 7 feet of clearance was now closer to 6.5. I could stand upright, but barely, and the psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. The room felt like it was slowly, systematically crushing itself around me. By 4 a.m., I was pacing the tiny space, ducking slightly to avoid bumping my head on the steadily lowering ceiling. The mirror had begun to show things that weren't there, shadows moving behind my reflection, faces that appeared and vanished in the span of a blink. The bookshelf's contents had rearranged themselves multiple times, the volumes sliding and shifting when I wasn't watching directly. The whispers from the walls had become clearer, though I still couldn't make out individual words. They seemed to be coming from multiple sources, as if a crowd of people were gathered just beyond the logs, all speaking at once in urgent, hushed tones. Sometimes I thought I heard my name mixed in with the incomprehensible murmur. The trunk below my room was definitely weakening. I could feel its distress through the floorboards, a deep vibration that spoke of structural failure and mounting desperation. The building's groans had become more frequent, and I'd begun to hear similar sounds from other parts of the lodge, other trunks struggling to support their assigned loads. With dawn still hours away, I realized I might not survive until morning. Not because the trunk would collapse, though that remained a very real possibility, but because my sanity was fragmenting under the pressure of staying awake in this impossible place. The room's dimensions seemed to shift when I wasn't paying attention, walls sliding closer together, the ceiling pressing down with malevolent intent. I tried to leave, but the door handle wouldn't turn. The wooden fob that served as my key had grown so warm it was almost painful to touch, and when I pressed it against the lock, nothing happened. I was trapped in a shrinking box, suspended above a starving tree that demanded my dreams as tribute. The final hours before dawn passed in a haze of mounting terror and exhaustion. The ceiling was now low enough that I had to crouch to move around the room. The whispers had become a constant susurrus, punctuated by scratching, and what sounded like heavy breathing from within the walls themselves. The mirror showed only darkness now, as if it were a window into some lightless void. But I held on. Through sheer stubbornness and mounting panic, I kept my eyes open, my mind active, denying the hungry trunk below the sustenance it craved. When the first pale light of morning finally began to filter through the window, the room shuddered violently, as if the building itself were convulsing in frustration. The ceiling stopped its descent. The whispers faded. The wooden key fob cooled in my palm. I opened the door and stumbled down the winding staircase, past the truth trunk that now appeared withered and dry, its pale bark cracked and flaking. Carl stood waiting in the lobby, his expression unreadable. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Shame. The trunk was just getting to know you." He handed me my bill. A single night's stay for $37. Most folks who pick truth end up staying much longer. I paid cash and practically ran to my car, desperate to put distance between myself and the rest lodge. The engine started on the first try, and I backed out of the gravel lot with reckless speed. In my rearview mirror, I watched the building recede into the morning mist until it vanished completely. The drive to Asheville took 3 hours on well-marked highways. My GPS worked perfectly, showing my location with crystal clarity. I checked into a conventional hotel and slept for 14 hours straight, my dreams vivid and uncontrolled, as if they were making up for lost time. But even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night with the taste of pine sap in my mouth and the sound of whispers in my ears. My reflection in mirrors occasionally shows shadows that aren't there, and I've developed an inexplicable fear of wooden furniture that creaks without being touched. I've searched online for any mention of the Mountain Rest Lodge, but found nothing. No reviews, no listings, no record that such a place ever existed. The road I took that night doesn't appear on any map I can find, and the locals in nearby towns claim no knowledge of a lodge matching my description. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really left that room, if I'm still crouched beneath that descending ceiling, my sanity slowly crumbling as the truth trunk feeds on whatever dreams I have left. The line between sleeping and waking has become uncomfortably thin, and I find myself checking the height of every ceiling I pass under, listening for the sound of hungry wood groaning in the darkness. The worst part is the growing certainty that someday, somehow, I'll find myself on that unmapped road again. And next time, I might not have the strength to stay awake until dawn. Story 14. The GPS died somewhere between Pagosa Springs and nowhere, leaving me with nothing but a hand-drawn map from a gas station attendant who'd sworn there was a shortcut through the mountains. 3 hours later, as my fuel gauge kissed empty and the October sun began its descent behind the peaks, I finally spotted smoke rising from what looked like civilization. Cedar Falls wasn't on any map I'd ever seen in 30 years of emergency medicine, not even the detailed topographical ones I'd studied during my time with search and rescue. The town materialized from the aspens like something that had simply grown there, weathered buildings hugging the valley floor as if they'd sprouted from the earth itself. A single main street wound between structures that seemed to lean into each other, their shadows already stretching long across the asphalt despite the afternoon hour. What struck me first wasn't the isolation or the dated architecture, it was the sound. Even before I rolled down my windows, I could hear it. A rhythmic thumping that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, like distant thunder that never quite rolled away. As I coasted down Main Street looking for a gas station, the sound resolved into something horrifyingly familiar. Heartbeats. They echoed from speakers mounted atop every streetlight, every telephone pole, creating a cacophony of overlapping cardiac rhythms that turned the entire town into one massive emergency room. Some beat steady and strong at 60 beats per minute, others raced at over 100, and a few struggled along irregularly, skipping beats like damaged machinery. Between the heartbeats, I caught fragments of other vital signs: the whispered rush of respiratory rates, the mechanical announcements of blood pressure readings, oxygen saturation levels. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as muscle memory kicked in. After 3 decades as a paramedic, those sounds were burned into my nervous system, each beep and tone associated with crisis, with life hanging in the balance. Yet as I drove deeper into town, scanning for any sign of medical emergency, I saw only ordinary people going about their evening routines. A woman in a floral dress watered her garden while a speaker directly above her head broadcast a blood pressure of 180 over 110, dangerously hypertensive. She hummed along with the readings as if they were a favorite song. An elderly man sat on his porch reading a newspaper while his own poll announced a heart rate of 45 beats per minute, so low it should have had him unconscious. He turned a page with steady hands, completely unperturbed. I found the gas station at the far end of town, a single pump in front of a building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The attendant emerged as I pulled up. A thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to track movement I couldn't see. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat vowels of native Colorado mountain folk. "Don't get many visitors," he said, beginning to pump gas without being asked, especially ones who look like they've seen something that bothers them. I realized I'd been staring at the speaker mounted above the pump, which was currently broadcasting someone's labored breathing at 32 respirations per minute, the kind of rate that usually accompanied severe distress. The attendant followed my gaze and smiled. "First time hearing the community broadcast?" Community broadcast? The words came out rougher than I'd intended. Those are medical readings, vital signs. Someone's in respiratory distress. "Oh, that's just Mrs. Henderson. She's been having a hard time with her breathing lately, so the town's been helping out. We share the load, you might say." The casual way he said it made my skin crawl. I'd spent my entire career learning to read the urgency in those numbers, to hear death approaching in irregular rhythms and failing pressures. Yet this man discussed them like weather reports. "What do you mean, share the load?" He finished pumping and hung up the nozzle, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Well, you're a medical man, aren't you? I can tell by the way you're listening to those readings. You understand how the body works better than most." I hadn't mentioned my background, and the observation sent ice through my veins. "How did you... The way you tense up when you hear an irregular rhythm, the way your eyes track to the speakers before you even realize you're doing it, takes training to develop those reflexes." He was right, of course. 30 years of responding to medical emergencies had hardwired certain responses into my nervous system, but there was something in his knowing smile that suggested he understood more than just occupational conditioning. "Cedar Falls is a special place," he continued, leading me toward the station building. "Been here for over a century, and we've learned some things about community that outsiders might find unusual. Would you like to come inside? There's coffee, and I think you'd benefit from understanding what you're hearing out there." Every instinct told me to decline, to pay for my gas and leave this valley as quickly as possible. But the logical part of my mind, the part trained to assess and understand medical situations, needed answers. The speakers continued their chorus around us, and I found myself cataloging the various readings with growing unease. Too many of them indicated serious medical conditions, yet I'd seen no evidence of illness among the townspeople. The interior of the gas station felt like stepping back in time. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a greenish pallor that reminded me of hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. The attendant poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since morning, and the bitter smell mixed with something else. something medicinal and sterile that made my nose wrinkle. "Name's Dale," he said, settling into a chair behind the counter. "Been running this place for 23 years, ever since I moved here from Denver. Used to be a nurse, actually. Emergency department." The coincidence felt too convenient, too perfectly tailored to my background. I remained standing, coffee cup warming my hands, more than I was comfortable drinking from it. "Those readings outside," I said. "Some of them indicate life-threatening conditions. If someone really has a blood pressure of 180 over 110, they need immediate medical attention." "And they're getting it," Dale replied. "Just not in the way you're used to thinking about it." He gestured toward the window, where I could see the main street and its collection of broadcasting poles. The sun had nearly set now, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, creating pools of yellow illumination beneath each speaker. Cedar Falls learned something a long time ago about survival in remote places like this. When you're hours from the nearest hospital, when winter storms can cut you off for months, you learn to take care of each other in ways that outsiders might not understand. That doesn't explain how we share vital signs. Dale's smile took on an edge that made me want to step back. "It's simpler than you might think, and more complicated than you'd believe." He moved to a cabinet behind the counter and withdrew what looked like a medical monitoring device, something between a blood pressure cuff and a heart rate monitor, but with additional components I didn't recognize. Wires snaked from the main unit to what appeared to be a small transmitter. "Every resident of Cedar Falls wears one of these," he explained. "It monitors their vital signs continuously and transmits the data to our community network. But it does more than just monitor. It can also regulate." "Regulate how?" "When someone's heart starts struggling, the system can supplement it. When someone's blood pressure spikes, it can redistribute the load. We share our bodily functions the same way we share our resources." The explanation should have sounded like science fiction, but something in Dale's matter-of-fact delivery made it feel plausible. I thought about the woman with dangerously high blood pressure who'd been calmly watering her garden, the elderly man with a heart rate that should have left him unconscious. "That's impossible," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. "Is it? You've spent 30 years watching bodies fail, watching people die because their hearts couldn't keep up, or their lungs couldn't process enough oxygen. What if I told you there was a way to prevent that? What if an entire community could function as a single organism, stronger than the sum of its parts?" Dale stood and moved toward me, the monitoring device in his hands. Up close, I could see that it was more sophisticated than anything I'd encountered in my medical career, with components that seemed to blend electronic circuitry with something organic. "We'd like to invite you to experience it for yourself," he said. "Just for tonight. You can hear your own pulse broadcast from our network. Feel what it's like to be part of something larger than yourself." The rational part of my mind screamed warnings. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The isolated town, the impossible technology, the casual discussion of sharing bodily functions. But I was also intensely curious. If what Dale described was real, it represented a breakthrough in medical technology that could revolutionize emergency care. What would it involve? Simple monitoring to start. We attach the device, and your vital signs join the community broadcast. You'll be able to hear your own heartbeat from the speakers outside. Know that the entire town is aware of your well-being. And if I want to leave? The device has a limited range. Once you drive out of the valley, the connection will break naturally. Though I should warn you, most people find the experience quite addictive. The way he said the last word made my skin crawl, but I found myself nodding agreement before I fully understood what I was accepting. Dale's smile widened as he began preparing the device, and I noticed that his movements had a practiced efficiency that spoke of countless repetitions. "Excellent. This will only take a moment." The device attached with surprising ease, its components seeming to mold themselves to my arm and chest. As the connections locked into place, I felt a strange tingling sensation, as if my nerves were being mapped and cataloged. Dale adjusted several settings on a small control unit and then stepped back. "There. You should be able to hear yourself now." At first, I heard nothing different from the cacophony already surrounding us. But gradually I began to pick out a new rhythm among the others, the steady 72 beats per minute of my own heart, broadcast with perfect clarity from the speakers outside. The sound of my own cardiovascular system made public felt deeply unsettling, as if my body's most private functions had been stripped naked and displayed for the world. "How does it feel?" Dale asked. "Strange. Invasive." "That's normal. The sensation fades as you adjust to being part of the community network. Why don't you take a walk through town? Get used to hearing yourself as part of the larger symphony." Against every rational impulse, I found myself stepping outside into the growing darkness. My heartbeat echoed from every speaker I passed, a constant reminder of my inclusion in whatever system governed this place. But as I walked, I began to notice something else, subtle changes in the rhythm and intensity of my own pulse. When I passed the elderly man on his porch, whose own heart rate had registered a dangerous 45 beats per minute, I felt my pulse slow slightly. When I walked near the woman with hypertension, my blood pressure seemed to rise. It was as if the device wasn't just broadcasting my vital signs, it was allowing them to be influenced by those around me. The realization should have sent me running back to my truck. Instead, I found myself fascinated by the sensation of physiological connection to strangers. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely useful, not just monitoring medical emergencies, but actively participating in preventing them. I lost track of time walking through Cedar Falls, listening to the chorus of vital signs that now included my own voice. The townspeople I encountered nodded at me with knowing smiles, as if my inclusion in their network had granted me membership in some exclusive club. No one seemed surprised to see me wearing the monitoring device, and several commented positively on my contribution to the community's health. It was past midnight when I finally returned to the gas station, where Dale waited with the same patient smile he'd worn hours earlier. "How was your evening?" "Unusual," I admitted. I could feel connections, like my body was responding to other people's needs. That's exactly what was happening. The beauty of our system is that it allows individuals to compensate for each other's weaknesses. Your healthy heart helped support Mr. Patterson's failing one. Your stable blood pressure offset Mrs. Chen's hypertension. You quite literally helped keep people alive tonight." The explanation filled me with a strange pride, even as part of my mind recoiled from the implications. How is that possible? "The human body is remarkably adaptable," Dale said. "With the right interface, the right understanding of bioelectric systems, it's possible to create genuine physiological connections between individuals. We've been refining the technology for decades. And people consent to this? To having their bodily functions controlled by others?" Dale's expression grew thoughtful. "Consent becomes a complex concept when survival is at stake. And once people experience the benefits, the security of knowing that illness or injury won't necessarily kill them, most find it difficult to imagine living any other way." Something in his tone made me uneasy, but before I could pursue the thought, exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. The long day of driving, combined with whatever physiological stress the monitoring device had put me under, left me struggling to keep my eyes open. "There's a motel just down the street," Dale said, seeming to read my condition. "Room 12 is always kept ready for visitors. You can settle up in the morning." I wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand exactly what I'd agreed to by accepting the device. But my body felt heavy and unresponsive, as if the effort of maintaining connections to the community network had drained some essential energy. I nodded groggily and stumbled toward the door. "Oh, and doctor?" Dale's voice stopped me at the threshold. "Sweet dreams. The network tends to make for very vivid rest." The motel room was Spartan but clean, with fixtures that matched the general 1970s aesthetic of the town. I collapsed onto the bed without bothering to undress, the monitoring device's gentle hum providing an oddly comforting backdrop to my exhaustion. As consciousness faded, I became aware of something that should have alarmed me. I could still hear the community's vital signs, even inside the building, even as I drifted toward sleep. But rather than disturbing my rest, the sounds seemed to cradle me, creating a lullaby of heartbeats and breathing rhythms that spoke of life persisting, of a community united in the most fundamental way possible. I dreamed of flowing electricity and shared blood, of hearts beating in perfect synchronization across an entire valley. In the dream, I was no longer an individual but part of something vast and interconnected, my consciousness distributed among dozens of bodies while retaining just enough selfhood to marvel at the experience. When I woke, it was to the sound of my own heart rate, now broadcasting at 95 beats per minute, significantly elevated from my normal resting rate. Morning light streamed through the motel window, but something felt fundamentally wrong. My body ached as if I'd been running for hours, and when I tried to sit up, waves of dizziness threatened to send me back onto the pillow. The monitoring device remained attached to my chest and arm, its display showing readings that should have been impossible. According to its sensors, my heart rate had spiked to over 140 beats per minute during the night before settling into its current elevated rhythm. My blood pressure registered higher than it had been in years, and other readings indicated physiological stress levels that should have had me seeking immediate medical attention. Yet I felt fine. Tired and slightly disoriented, but not ill. It was as if the device was measuring something other than my actual bodily functions. I stumbled outside, intending to return to the gas station and demand answers from Dale, but the sight that greeted me stopped me cold. Every speaker in town was broadcasting my elevated heart rate, filling the valley with the sound of my distress. Townspeople had gathered on their porches and in their yards, all watching me with expressions of concerned attention. But more disturbing than their stares was the realization that several of the other vital sign broadcasts had changed overnight. The elderly man, whose heart rate had been dangerously low, now showed readings in the normal range, while the woman with hypertension displayed perfect blood pressure. It was as if my body's stress had somehow been redistributed among the community, my elevated readings compensating for their improved ones. "Good morning, doctor." I spun to find Dale approaching from the direction of the gas station, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the same knowing smile I was beginning to hate. "Something's wrong with your device," I said, gesturing to the speakers broadcasting my rapid heartbeat. "The readings don't match how I feel." "Don't they?" Dale studied me with professional interest. "You look pale, slightly shaky. I'd say your body is under considerable stress, even if you're not consciously aware of it. I want this thing off me." Of course, though I should mention that disconnecting from the network after an extended connection can be uncomfortable. Your body has adapted to sharing its load with the community. Sudden isolation might be more difficult than you anticipate. The word isolation hit me with unexpected force. Looking around at the gathered townspeople, listening to the symphony of vital signs that now included my own panicked rhythm, I realized that the thought of returning to the silence of normal existence felt genuinely frightening. "How long do people usually stay connected?" Dale's smile widened. "That varies. Some visitors choose to remain for weeks or months. Others decide to make Cedar Falls their permanent home. And some just never leave. Why would they want to? Here, illness and injury lose their terror. Death becomes a community decision rather than an individual tragedy. People live longer, healthier lives as part of our network." The casual mention of death as a community decision sent ice through my veins. What does that mean? Simply that when someone's body begins to fail, the community can choose whether to support them indefinitely or to allow natural processes to continue. It removes the loneliness from dying, makes it a shared experience rather than a solitary struggle. I thought about the implications of what he was describing. A community that could collectively decide who lived and who died, who deserved the support of shared bodily functions, and who should be left to face mortality alone. The potential for abuse seemed limitless. "I want the device removed. Now." Dale's expression grew sympathetic, but I caught something else beneath it. Disappointment, or perhaps pity. "I understand your concerns, but I think you should experience one more aspect of our community before making a final decision. Tonight is special. The entire network will be operating at peak efficiency, and you'll have the opportunity to feel what true physiological unity means." "What happens tonight?" Community support. One of our residents is facing a significant medical crisis, and the entire town will be working together to keep them stable. Your participation could make the difference between life and death. Despite my growing alarm, I felt a familiar pull, the same instinct that had driven me through 3 decades of emergency medicine. If someone needed help, if I could make a difference. Who is it? What's wrong with them? Dale's smile took on an edge that made my stomach clench. You'll find out tonight. For now, I suggest you rest and prepare yourself. Tonight's connection will be unlike anything you've experienced. He turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in the middle of Main Street with my elevated heart rate echoing from every speaker in town. The gathered townspeople began to disperse, but their glances carried a weight that felt like assessment, as if they were measuring my value to their community, deciding whether I was worth keeping. I spent the day in the motel room trying to understand what I'd gotten myself into. The monitoring device remained active despite my attempts to remove it, its components seeming to have merged with my skin in ways that defied explanation. Every time I touched the connection points, I felt a jolt of something between electricity and pain, followed by a wave of disorientation that left me gasping. As evening approached, I heard changes in the community broadcast. Heart rates began to synchronize, blood pressures aligned, and respiratory rhythms fell into harmony. It was as if the entire town was preparing for a coordinated effort, their bodies tuning themselves like instruments in an orchestra. Then I heard it, a new signal among the others, weak and irregular. Someone's heart was failing, their pulse faltering in the pattern I'd learned to associate with impending cardiac arrest. Other readings suggested multiple organ systems under severe stress, the kind of comprehensive breakdown that usually preceded death. Without conscious decision, I found myself heading for the door. 30 years of emergency response had trained certain reflexes into me, and the sound of someone dying triggered responses deeper than rational thought. The street outside was filled with townspeople, all standing motionless beneath the speakers as if listening to a concert. Their faces showed intense concentration, and I could see the monitoring devices on their arms and chests pulsing with increased activity. Dale waited for me near the gas station, his expression grave but expectant. "Are you ready to help save a life, Doctor?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The failing heart rate continued to echo around us, growing weaker with each passing moment. "Good. Tonight you'll understand what our community truly means." He led me to the center of town, where a chair had been placed directly beneath the largest speaker array. The sound of the dying heartbeat was almost overwhelming here, accompanied by the gasping rhythm of failing lungs and the electronic alerts of critical vital signs. "Sit," Dale instructed, "and prepare to give everything you have." As I settled into the chair, I felt the monitoring device on my body surge to life with new intensity. Suddenly I could feel the failing heartbeat as if it were my own, could sense the desperate struggle of organs shutting down one by one. But more than feeling it, I was connected to it, my own cardiovascular system somehow linked to the person in crisis. Around me, the townspeople stood in perfect stillness, their own devices pulsing in rhythm as they channeled their life force toward the failing individual. I felt my own heart rate begin to climb as the system drew on my cardiovascular strength, my healthy organs compensating for someone else's failure. The sensation was unlike anything I'd experienced in medicine, not the clinical detachment of treating a patient, but the visceral reality of sharing their struggle for survival. I could feel their pain, their terror, their desperate will to live, and I could feel my own life force flowing out to support them. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time became meaningless in the shared struggle against death. My body ached from the effort of supporting another's failing systems, but I also felt a profound sense of purpose. This was what I devoted my career to, preserving life, fighting the inevitable approach of mortality. Gradually, the failing heartbeat began to strengthen. The gasping respirations smoothed into more regular rhythms. The critical alerts faded as organ systems stabilized under the community's combined support. When it was over, I felt drained in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was as if something essential had been drawn out of me, some vital essence that would take time to replenish. Around me, the other townspeople began to disperse, their faces showing the same profound fatigue I felt. Dale remained beside my chair, watching me with intense interest. "How do you feel?" "Exhausted, but satisfied." The word surprised me as I spoke it. Despite the drain on my system, I felt more fulfilled than I had in years. "Did we save them?" "You all did, yes. Though I should clarify something about tonight's experience." Something in his tone made me look up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The person you helped save? It was you, Doctor. Your own systems were failing from the stress of disconnection from our network. Tonight, the community chose to keep you alive." The words hit me like ice water. I tried to stand but found my legs unsteady, my body weak from the night's ordeal. "That's impossible. I felt fine before." "You felt fine because the device was masking the symptoms. But your body has been in crisis since you arrived in Cedar Falls. The isolation from normal medical support, the stress of our unfamiliar environment, the physiological shock of joining our network, all of it combined to create a cascade of system failures." Dale knelt beside my chair, his expression mixing sympathy with something else I couldn't identify. "The good news is that you're stable now. The community has accepted you fully, and your life signs are stronger than they've been in years. The challenging news is that disconnecting from our network at this point would likely be fatal." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. "You're saying I can never leave?" "I'm saying that leaving would mean death." "But why would you want to leave? You've experienced what it means to truly save a life, to be part of something larger than individual existence. You felt the security of knowing that illness and injury will never again be faced alone." Around us, the speakers continued their chorus of vital signs, dozens of heartbeats, breathing rhythms, and life indicators, creating a symphony of continued existence. My own readings were among them now, permanently woven into the community's song. "This was planned," I said, the realization hitting me with horrible clarity. "You brought me here deliberately. We've been monitoring emergency services communications for years, looking for the right kind of person. Someone with medical training, someone isolated enough that their disappearance wouldn't trigger immediate investigation. When we learned about a retired paramedic traveling alone through our region..." Dale's shrug was almost apologetic. "Cedar Falls needs new residents occasionally. Our population faces the same mortality pressures as any community. Sometimes we need to recruit new members to maintain the network's stability." The casual way he discussed my kidnapping made my stomach turn. I tried again to stand, but my body refused to cooperate. The monitoring device seemed to have taken more complete control, regulating my movements as well as my vital signs. "People will look for me." "Perhaps. But you're officially a missing person who disappeared in the Colorado wilderness. One of dozens who vanish in these mountains every year. And your truck had an unfortunate accident on the mountain road outside town. Brake failure on those steep curves can be fatal." The implications of what he was telling me slowly sank in. I was trapped not just by the monitoring device, but by the complete erasure of my normal existence. Even if I could somehow escape Cedar Falls, I would be returning to a world that believed me dead. "The device will come off eventually," Dale continued. "Once your body has fully adapted to life as part of our network. But that process typically takes months, sometimes years. And by then, most people find they have no desire to return to the loneliness of individual existence." He stood and brushed dust from his knees, preparing to leave me alone with the reality of my situation. "Welcome to Cedar Falls, Doctor. I think you'll find that community life suits you." As his footsteps faded, I sat in the darkness listening to the town's vital signs, including my own. My heart rate had settled into a steady rhythm that seemed to complement rather than compete with the other broadcasts. My blood pressure showed the stability that comes from being part of a larger system. But beneath the medical readings, something else echoed through the speakers. Something that might have been the sound of dozens of people breathing in perfect unnatural synchronization, or might have been nothing more than the wind moving through the valley. In the darkness of Cedar Falls, Surrounded by the electronic evidence of shared life, I found myself unable to tell the difference between community and captivity, between salvation and slow dissolution into something no longer entirely human. The speakers continued their endless broadcast, and I listened with growing uncertainty about which heartbeat was truly mine.